The gravel crunched under my boots at 7:15 on a Saturday morning in late March, when the cold still had teeth, but the sun promised something different by noon. I stood in the parking lot of Hastings Farm Equipment watching trucks pull in one after another, diesel engines rumbling like distant thunder, exhaust rising in pale columns against a sky that couldn't decide between gray and blue. 200 farmers would be here before the auction started at 9, maybe more. And I was early because I'd learned 50 years ago that being early meant getting a good look at what you came for before the crowd turned looking into competing. The 1998 John Deere 566 round baler sat in row 3, lot 14, painted that particular shade of green that meant serious work to anyone who understood what machines like that represented. I'd walked past it twice already, checking the roller condition and the twine arms and the pickup teeth, running my hand along the frame where stress cracks would show if they were going to show at all. The estimate was $18,000 to $22,000, which was fair for a baler that age if it had been maintained right, and from what I could see it had been. My own baler was a 1982 model that had been held together by welds and faith for the last 3 seasons, and this spring I needed something that would actually make it through hay season without leaving me stranded in a field at midnight with half a crop still on the ground. I wore what I always wore. Wrangler jeans faded to something closer to gray than blue, with an oil stain on the left thigh from when I'd changed the hydraulic fluid on my feed truck 2 weeks back. Boots that were 15 years old, good leather that I'd resoled 3 times because boots that fit right are worth more than boots that look right. A Carhartt jacket that Anna had bought me in 2006, back when she was still here to notice that my old one had holes in both pockets. And I'd driven my 2003 Ford F-250 with 287,000 miles on the odometer and a passenger side door that didn't quite match the rest of the paint because I'd replaced it myself from a salvage yard outside Alliance. Standing there in that parking lot with the cold working its way through my jacket and my coffee going lukewarm in the travel mug I'd forgotten to drink from, I looked exactly like what I was. A 73-year-old cattle rancher who'd spent more time thinking about whether fence posts would last another winter than whether his clothes would impress anyone at a farm equipment auction. And that was fine. That had always been fine. The work didn't care what I looked like, and neither did the cattle, and neither did the land that had been teaching me the same lessons for 54 years, whether I wanted to learn them or not. A white pickup truck pulled into the space next to mine, new enough that the paint still had that factory shine, and a young man climbed out wearing pressed jeans and a jacket with the Hastings Farm Equipment logo embroidered over the chest pocket. He was maybe 28 or 29, clean-shaven, hair cut in that style young men wear when they're trying to look professional but haven't quite figured out what professional means beyond copying what they see in advertisements. He had good teeth and soft hands, the kind of hands that had never rebuilt a transmission or spent March mornings pulling calves in a barn with no heat. He looked at my truck first, took in the mismatched door and the mud on the wheel wells and the crack in the windshield that I kept meaning to fix but never quite got around to because it didn't affect the way the truck drove. Then he looked at me, and something in his expression settled into a kind of polite tolerance that made my jaw tighten in a way I recognized from other moments in other places when people had looked at me and decided they knew everything they needed to know. He smiled with those good teeth and walked over with the easy confidence of someone who'd never been told he wasn't welcome anywhere. "Morning, sir, you here with someone?" I took a sip of the lukewarm coffee and looked at him over the rim of the mug. "Just myself." He nodded, still smiling, and glanced back toward the rows of equipment lined up for auction like soldiers waiting for inspection. These auctions can get pretty technical. Lot of complicated machinery, lot of fast bidding, Easy to get confused if you're not familiar with how they work. We have a viewing area for spectators over by the main building if you just want to watch. The coffee tasted like it had been sitting in the pot too long before I'd poured it, bitter and thin. And I swallowed it anyway because wasting coffee felt wrong even when the coffee wasn't worth drinking. I'm not here to watch, I'm here to bid. Something shifted in his face, a recalculation happening behind eyes that had already sorted me into a category that didn't include serious buyer. Oh well, that's great. What are you looking at? The 566 baler in row 3. His eyebrows went up just enough to notice. That's a $20,000 machine, sir. Pretty sophisticated equipment. Have you operated a round baler before? I've been running balers since before you were born. He laughed, not mean exactly, but the way people laugh when they think someone's being funny without meaning to be. I'm sure you have, sir. But that's newer technology, computer controls, a lot different from the old models. Maybe you should bring your son along or your farm manager, someone who understands the technical specifications. We also have excellent financing options if cash flow is a concern. The parking lot was filling up now, trucks pulling in every few seconds, men climbing out and heading toward the equipment with that particular walk farmers have, purposeful but unhurried, because rushing doesn't get the work done any faster, and patience is something the land teaches you whether you want to learn it or not. Somewhere across the lot, a diesel engine backfired, and a pair of crows lifted off from the roof of the main building, their calls sharp and annoyed in the cold morning air. I don't need financing. I don't need my son. I need to register for the auction. The young man's smile tightened at the corners, and he glanced toward the main building where other staff members were setting up registration tables and laying out bidder paddles in neat rows. Of course, sir. Registration is right over there. But I really do think you should consider our financing options, or maybe wait until you can bring someone who's more familiar with this level of equipment. We wouldn't want you to make a purchase you're not comfortable with. He said it like he was doing me a favor, like he was protecting me from my own poor judgment. And maybe he believed that. Maybe he looked at my truck and my boots and my 73 years and genuinely thought he was helping an old man who'd wandered into a situation beyond his understanding. I registered anyway, took paddle number 247 and walked back out into the lot where the crowd was gathering thick now. Men I'd known for decades and men I'd never seen before. All of them here because March meant it was time to think about what equipment would make it through another season, and what equipment needed replacing before it left you stranded at the worst possible moment. Carl Jensen found me near row 5, 78 years old and still running 2,000 acres of wheat and cattle north of Chadron. We'd known each other since 1971, when he'd helped me pull my truck out of a ditch during a spring snowstorm that had come out of nowhere and left 3 feet of snow on roads that had been clear the day before. Clay Morrison, I heard you were looking at the 566. Word travels fast. Only kind of speed that matters around here. You gonna bid on it? That's the plan. Good. That old 82 baler of yours sounds like it's dying every time you run it. Surprised it made it through last season. Surprised me too. He nodded and looked out across the rows of equipment, at the tractors and balers and cultivators and combines that represented more money than most people would see in a lifetime. All of it built for the specific purpose of working ground that didn't care about money or status or anything, except whether you did the work right or did it wrong. You know Tyler Hastings, the kid who just tried to send me to the spectator area. That's Douglas's boy. Took over most of the sales operation last year. Got an MBA from Creighton, thinks that means he knows farming. Does he? Carl snorted. He knows spreadsheets, knows profit margins, knows how to talk to people who already know they want to buy something. But he looks at customers and sees numbers instead of people, sees an old truck and assumes poor instead of practical, sees gray hair and assumes confused instead of experienced. I'd seen it before. Seen it in 1975 when I'd walked into First Montana Bank at 24 years old, wearing my father's work jacket because it was the warmest thing I owned, and the loan officer had looked at me like I was there to ask for directions instead of ask for money. Seen it in 1989 when I tried to buy a used tractor from a dealer in Scottsbluff, and the salesman had kept trying to redirect me to lawn mowers. Seen it enough times that I should have been used to it by now, should have developed the thick skin that comes from being underestimated so often that the underestimation stops mattering. But I hadn't. 50 years later and it still landed the same way, still made my chest tight and my hands want to curl into fists, still made me want to prove something I shouldn't have to prove. The auction started at 9 sharp. The auctioneer was a man named Robert Chambers who'd been calling farm equipment sales for 30 years, voice trained to that rapid-fire cadence that sounded like a foreign language until you learned to hear the numbers underneath the rhythm. He started with smaller lots, working his way through cultivator parts and used toolboxes and a pallet of hydraulic fluid that sold for less than retail, because everyone knew you could get the same thing at the co-op without having to haul it home from an auction. I stood near the back with Carl, paddle in my hand, waiting for lot 14 to come up. Tyler Hastings was working the crowd, pointing out features to potential bidders, answering questions about maintenance history and hour meters, and whether financing was available for purchases over $10,000. He was good at it in the way that people who have been trained in sales are good at it, smooth and professional and attentive to anyone who looked like they had money to spend. He didn't look at me once. Lot 14 came up at 9:45. The 566 baler rolling to the front of the auction area on a trailer pulled by a Hastings employee. The sun had finally won its argument with the clouds, and the green paint gleamed in the light, factory fresh despite being 26 years old, maintained by someone who understood that equipment lasted longer when you treated it right. Robert Chambers started the bidding at $15,000. A farmer from over by Gordon raised his paddle and the price jumped to $16,000. Another bid from someone I didn't recognize, $17,000. I raised my paddle, $17,500. Tyler Hastings noticed. I saw him turn and look at me, saw him say something to another staff member, saw them both glance my direction with expressions I couldn't quite read from that distance but could guess at easily enough. 18,000 from the Gordon farmer, 18,500 from the stranger, 19 from me. The auctioneer's voice rolled on, numbers climbing, rhythm steady, and I kept my paddle ready because this was the baler I'd come for, and I'd seen enough auctions to know that once you committed to bidding you stayed committed until you won or until the price went past what the equipment was worth. 19,500, 20, 2,500. Tyler Hastings was walking toward me now, weaving through the crowd with purpose, and I knew what was coming before he opened his mouth because I'd seen that look before too. That mixture of concern and condescension that people wear when they think they're about to save you from yourself. He reached me just as the bidding hit 20,000. Sir, excuse me, sir. I didn't lower my paddle. That's a $20,000 machine. Maybe you should consider your budget before you go any higher. We have financing available if you need it, but I really think you should talk to someone, maybe your son or your financial advisor, before you make this kind of commitment. His voice was pitched just loud enough that the men standing near me could hear. Carl Jensen heard it. The Gordon farmer heard it. Half a dozen other ranchers I'd known for decades heard it. And in that moment, standing in the middle of 200 farmers with the sun bright overhead, and the auctioneer's voice calling for 2,500 and my hand holding a paddle that represented a decision I'd already made, I had a choice. I could raise the paddle again, could bid 25 and then 3,000 and then whatever it took to win this auction and prove to Tyler Hastings and everyone else watching that I knew exactly what I was doing and could afford exactly what I wanted. Or I could lower the paddle, could walk away, could let Tyler's assumption stand unchallenged and go home with my 73 years and my old truck and my dying baler, and the knowledge that fighting every fight eventually just made you tired. I lowered the paddle. The Gordon farmer bid 21,000 and won the lot, and Tyler Hastings smiled that professional smile and moved on to the next potential customer. And I stood there feeling the weight of something I couldn't quite name settle into my chest like water filling a low spot in a field. Carl Jensen didn't say anything. Didn't need to. We'd known each other long enough that silence could communicate everything that needed communicating. I walked back to my truck at 10:15 with the auction still running, lots 15 through 40 still to go, equipment I had no interest in being sold to people who apparently looked like they could afford it. The F-250's engine started on the first turn of the key, the way it always did because I maintained it properly, and didn't ask it to do anything it wasn't built to do. The heat took 3 minutes to start working, and I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, looking through the cracked windshield at the main building, where Tyler Hastings was visible through the plate glass windows, talking to someone and gesturing with his hands in a way that suggested he was telling a story. I didn't need to hear the story to know what it was. The old man in the work clothes who'd thought he could bid on a $20,000 baler. The one who'd needed to be gently redirected before he embarrassed himself by spending money he probably didn't have. The kind of story that salesmen tell each other to prove they're good at their jobs, that they know how to protect customers from their own poor judgment, that they understand who belongs in their showrooms and who doesn't. My hands rested on the steering wheel and I looked at them. 73 years of work written in every line and callus and scar. The crooked ring finger on my right hand from when I'd caught it in a gate latch in 1979, and said it myself because I was too busy with spring planting to drive an hour to the emergency room in Scottsbluff. The burn mark on my left wrist from a hydraulic line that had blown hot fluid when I was replacing it on a tractor my father had bought new 2 months before his first heart attack. Hands that had rebuilt engines and delivered calves, and signed purchase agreements for land that bankers said a young man couldn't manage alone. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket and scrolled through the contacts to a name I hadn't called in 18 months. Helen Riverside. We talked at Anna's funeral, standing in the parking lot of the Methodist church while people who'd barely known her said kind things they'd rehearsed on the drive over. She'd hugged me and told me to call if I needed anything, and I'd nodded and meant it the way people mean those things at funerals. Sincerely but abstractly, knowing that need and asking are two different things, and I'd spent 50 years proving I could handle things without asking. The phone rang 3 times before her voice came through, clear and sharp despite being 71 years old, and having built an agricultural equipment empire worth $340 million. Clay Morrison, I thought you'd finally retired. Helen, I need a favor. The pause on the other end lasted maybe 2 seconds, but I could hear the shift in her breathing. That change from casual greeting to focused attention that happens when someone who spent 50 years building a business hears something in a friend's voice that doesn't fit the usual pattern. Talk to me. I told her about the auction and Tyler Hastings, and the way he'd looked at my truck before he looked at my face. Told her about the suggestion that I bring someone qualified to make decisions, about the financing options for customers who apparently couldn't afford to buy equipment with cash. I kept my voice level and factual, the same tone I'd use reporting on cattle weights or hay yields, because anger was something I'd learned to keep private, something that burned cleaner when it burned alone. That condescending little. The words cut off sharp and I heard her take a breath, reset, choose a different path. Give me 72 hours, Clay. Helen, I don't need you to. 72 hours, just trust me. The line went dead before I could respond, and I sat there holding the phone and watching through the windshield as Tyler Hastings finished his story and headed back toward the auction area, probably to help facilitate more sales to people who looked like they belonged there. I drove home taking the long way, past the Chen farm where Emma and David were trying to make 80 acres work with equipment they had to borrow from neighbors who didn't always have it to spare. Past the Martinez family's 40 acres, where Javier still cut hay with methods his grandfather had used, because tractors cost money that working ground by hand didn't provide. The road curved past my south section, where I'd planted winter wheat that was just starting to show green through the brown stubble, and then up the hill to the house my father had built in 1956, when land was cheap and labor was cheaper, and a man could raise 6 kids on 320 acres if he worked hard enough and didn't spend money on anything that wouldn't pay him back in yield or livestock weight. Anna's garden was still there, dormant and waiting for spring. The fence I'd built around it in 1985 still standing straight because I'd used good posts and set them deep. The porch where we'd sat on summer evenings when the work was done, and the air was finally cool enough to breathe. The bedroom window where I'd watched her die over 18 months, ALS taking her piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the memory of who she'd been and the empty space where she used to be. I sat in the truck for 10 minutes with the engine off, watching the house that held 54 years of memories, and thought about my father Walter, who died in 1975 and left me 320 acres and $29,000 in debt, and the belief that land was worth fighting for even when the fight looked impossible. Thought about Frank Riverside, who'd loaned my father money in 1953 when banks wouldn't, who'd refused to charge interest because interest felt too much like profiting from someone else's struggle. Thought about the chain of help that was supposed to connect generations, that was supposed to make the hard things easier for the people coming after you. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. A text message from Jack, my son who lived 3 hours away in Omaha and called every other Sunday out of obligation more than interest. Dad, I heard what happened at the auction. Maybe it's time to think about selling the ranch, moving closer to me. You're 73. This is getting too hard for you to handle alone. I stared at the message for a long time, reading it 3 times to make sure I understood what he was actually saying underneath what he'd written. That I was too old. That managing 4,800 acres by myself wasn't sustainable. That the smart thing, the reasonable thing, the thing any sensible person would do, was to quit while I still could instead of waiting until I couldn't anymore. He wasn't wrong. 73 was old by any measure, and running a cattle operation this size alone was hard even when you were young and strong and had a partner to share the load. But wrong and right weren't the same thing as possible and impossible, and I'd spent 54 years learning the difference. I didn't reply to the text. Didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound defensive or stubborn or like an old man refusing to admit what everyone else could already see. Instead, I walked to the barn and pulled open the door that had hung on its hinges since 1956 and looked at the 1982 John Deere baler sitting in the shadows where I'd parked it after last season. The baler didn't look old. It looked tired. The paint was faded and the roller bearings were worn and the hydraulic lines had been replaced so many times that I'd stopped keeping track, but it still worked. Still picked up hay and compressed it into round bales and tied them off with twine that cost more every year but held just the same. Still did exactly what it was built to do, just slower now, just with more noise and more worry that this would be the day something critical finally gave up. "You and me both," I said to the machine that couldn't hear me and wouldn't have cared if it could. The afternoon passed the way Saturdays always passed when there was work to do and no particular urgency to doing it. I checked water tanks and fixed a section of fence wire that had come loose during the last wind storm and moved a group of cattle from the east pasture to the north section, where the grass was starting to come in better. Physical work that required attention but not thought, the kind of work that let your mind wander while your hands stayed busy. I thought about 1975, about being 24 years old and standing in my father's barn 3 days after his funeral, trying to figure out how to pay $29,000 in debt when I barely understood how to run a ranch without him. Thought about walking into First Montana Bank in clothes that smelled like cattle and sweat, and being told that farming wasn't a job for someone my age, that I should sell the land and find something more suitable to my experience level. I thought about Margaret Chen at Prairie State Credit Union, who'd looked at the same numbers and seen possibility instead of risk, who'd approved a loan with an interest rate 3 points higher than the bank would have charged, but with respect included at no extra charge. Thought about paying off that loan in 7 years while buying my first additional 80 acres and proving that assumptions about age worked both ways. I thought about meeting Anna at the county fair in 1977, about the way she'd looked at me and seen a farmer instead of a kid playing at farming, about the 44 years we'd built together before ALS took her and left me alone again at 68. And I thought about Helen Riverside, about 1982 when her grandfather Frank was dying and the family equipment business was drowning in debt that banks wouldn't restructure. About giving her $12,000, every cent I had saved after 5 years of 70-hour weeks and deferred purchases, and living so far below my means that Anna used to joke we were underground. About Helen taking that money and rebuilding the business into something that eventually sold for $340 million. The sun was setting when I finished the work and walked back to the house. Sky going pink and orange in that particular way it goes in Nebraska, when there's enough dust in the air to catch the light but not enough clouds to block it. The temperature was dropping fast the way it drops in March when the sun gives up jurisdiction to the cold, and I stood on the porch for a few minutes watching the light fade across 4,800 acres that I owned outright, debt-free since 2001. Worth approximately $17 million at current market rates. $17 million in land and cattle and equipment, and I couldn't bid on a $20,000 baler without some 28-year-old salesman assuming I needed permission or financing or someone qualified to hold my hand through the complicated process of raising a paddle. My phone rang at 7:30. Helen Riverside's name lit up the screen. "Tuesday morning, 6:30, be home." That's all. That's all you need to know. "Helen, what are you planning?" "You'll see, just be there." The line went dead and I stood in the kitchen holding the phone and looking out the window at the barn, where the tired baler sat waiting for one more season, wondering what Helen was planning. Wondering if I should have just raised the paddle and won the auction and let Tyler Hastings think whatever he wanted to think. Wondering if at 73 I was finally old enough to stop caring what people assumed about me. But I wasn't. 54 years and I still wasn't. Outside the window, the last light faded from the sky and the temperature dropped below freezing, and the land settled into darkness the way it settled every night, patient and eternal, waiting for morning when the work would begin again, whether I was ready for it or not. Monday evening came with clouds building in the west, and the wind picking up in that way that meant weather was thinking about moving in. I was checking the water tanks in the north pasture when I heard the sound of an engine that didn't belong to any truck I recognized, smooth and quiet in a way that farm vehicles never are, because farm vehicles are built for work, not comfort. A black Cadillac Escalade came up the gravel road throwing dust that caught the late sun and turned gold before settling back to earth, and I knew before it stopped who was driving it. Helen Riverside climbed out wearing jeans that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, and a jacket that looked like it belonged in a corporate boardroom, not a cattle ranch in the Nebraska sandhills. But she moved across the uneven ground like someone who remembered how to walk on dirt, who hadn't always had money enough to buy vehicles that cost more than tractors. And when she hugged me, it was the kind of hug that came from 53 years of friendship that had survived distance and success, and all the ways life tries to pull people apart. "You look tired, Clay." "I am tired, been tired since Anna died, before that even." She stepped back and looked at me the way people look when they're trying to see past what's visible to what's underneath, and I wondered what she saw. An old man wearing 73 years like a coat that didn't quite fit anymore. A rancher who'd spent 5 decades proving things that shouldn't need proving. Someone who'd called asking for help because he finally didn't know what else to do. "Tell me again what happened. Everything. Don't leave anything out." We walked to the house, and I made coffee that was better than what I'd had at the auction, and we sat at the kitchen table where Anna and I had sat for 44 years making decisions about equipment purchases and cattle sales, and which fields to plant and which to leave fallow. Helen listened without interrupting, the way good listeners do, the way people who built $340 million businesses do, because listening is how you learn things that spreadsheets can't tell you. When I finished, she sat quiet for a long moment, coffee cup cradled in both hands, steam rising in lazy spirals between us. "Do you remember 1982? Every day. Frank was dying, pancreatic cancer, 3 months from diagnosis to funeral. The equipment business had $290,000 in debt, and the banks wouldn't restructure because they'd already decided we were going under. I was 29 years old, and I'd never run anything more complicated than a cash register. You ran it fine." "I ran it into the ground for 6 months. Lost $12,000 in inventory to a warehouse fire. Lost another $8,000 when a dealer in Kansas went bankrupt owing us money. I was 3 weeks from filing Chapter 11 when you showed up." The memory sat between us clear as the coffee steam. Me driving to her grandfather's place with a check for $12,000, every cent I'd saved in 7 years of ranching. Her crying at the kitchen table while Frank sat in a wheelchair too weak to stand, but still trying to tell her how to save the business he'd built over 40 years. The look on her face when I handed her the check and told her to pay me back by helping someone else someday. "You gave me everything you had, Clay." It was the right thing to do. Frank helped my father in 1953, loaned him $4,000 to buy our first land when every bank in 3 counties said no. He refused interest, refused a timeline, just said pay it forward when you can. That's how it's supposed to work. Helen set down her coffee cup and pulled out her phone, fingers moving across the screen with the speed of someone who lived half their life in digital space, and after a moment she turned it toward me. The screen showed a photograph of a young woman standing in front of a building, with Riverside Agricultural Solutions painted on the sign, the same building where her grandfather Frank had run his equipment business for 40 years before the debt, and the cancer had tried to take it all away. "That's me in 1995, 13 years after you saved us. Revenue that year was $8.2 million. By 2000 it was $34 million. By 2010, $112 million. I sold to John Deere Corporate in 2018 for $340 million. I know, I read about it in the ag journals. Do you know what the return on your investment was? I didn't invest, I helped. Her smile was small and sad and knowing. 12,000 in 1982, adjusted for inflation, is about 38,000 in today's dollars. If you'd put it in index funds, you'd have about 200,000 now. Instead, you gave it to me with no expectation of return, and I turned it into 340 million. The return on your generosity was approximately 28,000%. The wind rattled the kitchen window, and somewhere outside a loose piece of metal on the barn was making that rhythmic banging sound that meant I needed to climb up there and fix it before it worked itself completely free. Helen was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and determination, and maybe a little bit of anger that wasn't directed at me, but at the world that had made this conversation necessary. Saturday morning, there's another auction at Hastings Farm Equipment. Different equipment, bigger lots. I'm going to be there. Helen, you don't need to do anything. I'm going to buy some things. Quite a few things, actually. And I'm going to make sure Tyler Hastings understands exactly who he dismissed last week. The way she said it made it clear that arguing would be pointless, that she'd already made her decision and was just informing me out of courtesy. And I knew that tone because I'd heard it before in boardrooms and on phone calls when she was negotiating deals that involved more money than most people could imagine. What are you planning? You'll see, just be there Saturday morning at 7. Trust me, Clay, the way I trusted you in 1982. She stayed for dinner, heating up the casserole that Emma Chen had brought over 3 days ago when she'd stopped by to ask about borrowing my fence stretcher. We talked about Anna and about Frank, and about all the people we'd known who weren't here anymore. And when she left at 9, the Escalade's taillights disappeared down the gravel road like red stars falling into darkness. Tuesday passed slow. I worked on fence repair in the east section and tried not to think about Saturday, tried to focus on the physical work of digging post holes and stretching wire, and stapling it tight to cedar posts that would last another 20 years if I set them right. But my mind kept wandering to Helen's face when she'd said she was going to buy some things, to the way she'd looked at me like she was about to settle an old debt that had been accumulating interest for 42 years. Jack called Tuesday evening while I was making dinner, his voice carrying that careful neutrality that meant he'd rehearsed what he wanted to say. Dad, I've been thinking about what I texted on Saturday, about you maybe selling the ranch. I figured you had. I want you to know I'm not trying to push you out of your own home. I just worry. You're 73 and you're working a schedule that would exhaust someone half your age. I've been doing this my whole life, Jack. I know, that's kind of my point. You've earned the right to rest. The stove timer went off and I turned down the burner under the skillet where ground beef was browning for tacos. The smell of cumin and chili powder filling the kitchen with memories of dinners Anna used to make when Jack was young enough to think his parents might actually know things worth knowing. Rest is what happens when the work is finished. Work's never finished. He sighed, and I could picture him in his Omaha apartment, probably standing at the window looking out at city lights that never went dark, at streets that were paved and level, and designed for people who thought concrete was as close to earth as they needed to get. I'm coming out there this weekend. Saturday, I want to see you. Saturday, I'll be at an auction. Then I'll meet you there. What time? 7 in the morning, Hastings Farm Equipment. I'll be there. The line went dead, and I stood in the kitchen wondering what had changed, what had shifted in the 5 days since he'd texted me about selling the ranch, whether he was coming to check on me, or to stage some kind of intervention where he and maybe Sarah, his girlfriend, would sit me down and explain gently but firmly that it was time to face reality. Saturday morning arrived clear and cold, temperature hovering right around freezing when I drove toward Hastings Farm Equipment at 6:45. The sun was just starting to think about rising, sky going from black to deep blue in the east, and the roads were empty except for a few other trucks heading the same direction. Farmers and ranchers who'd seen the advertisements for the auction and were coming to see what might be worth buying. The parking lot at Hastings was already filling up when I arrived, maybe 60 trucks and a few cars, people standing in small groups drinking coffee from thermoses and stamping their feet against the cold. I parked in the same spot I'd parked the week before, and the irony of that wasn't lost on me. But I'd learned a long time ago that irony was something you acknowledged and then ignored because dwelling on it didn't change anything. Tyler Hastings was near the main building talking to his father Douglas, both of them wearing jackets with the dealership logo, both of them looking professional and competent, and ready to facilitate another successful auction. Tyler saw me and his expression shifted into something that might have been embarrassment or might have been just the awkwardness of seeing someone you'd misjudged, and he started to walk over. Before he reached me, I heard the sound of engines approaching from the south, multiple engines, the deep rumble of heavy trucks moving together. 3 equipment transport trucks turned into the parking lot in a convoy, each one hauling an empty flatbed trailer, and behind them came the black Escalade I recognized immediately. The trucks parked in a row along the back of the lot, taking up space normally reserved for equipment being delivered after purchase, and Helen Riverside climbed out of the Escalade wearing clothes that split the difference between ranch work and boardroom presence. She saw me and waved, then walked over with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you're about to do and being absolutely certain it's the right thing. Tyler Hastings had stopped halfway between the building and my truck, watching the convoy with an expression that suggested he was trying to calculate what was happening and not quite getting there. Helen reached me and hugged me briefly. "You ready for this?" "I don't know what this is." "You will, just watch." She walked toward the registration table where staff members were laying out bidder paddles and clipboards, and I watched her register and receive paddle number 4, and something in the way she held it suggested that paddle was going to get a lot of use in the next few hours. The crowd was growing now, 200 people and climbing, word having spread that this auction included some premium equipment, newer tractors and implements that normally wouldn't show up at a regional sale. Tyler Hastings had made his way to his father Douglas, and they were both watching Helen with expressions that suggested they'd recognized her, and were trying to figure out what her presence meant for their auction. The auctioneer started at 9 sharp, same man as last week, Robert Chambers with his practiced cadence, and his ability to make numbers sound like music if you listened long enough. He started with smaller lots, working up to the bigger equipment, and Helen stood near the front with her paddle ready and her posture suggesting she was here for business, not browsing. Lot 6 came up at 9:15. A 2018 John Deere 6155R tractor, green paint gleaming in the morning sun that had finally cleared the horizon, estimated value $78,000. The kind of tractor that could handle serious field work, that represented a major investment for any operation. Robert Chambers started the bidding at $65,000. A farmer from Chadron raised his paddle, $70,000. Another bidder, $75,000. Helen raised paddle number 4, $78,000. The Chadron farmer bid again, $80,000. Helen didn't hesitate. $82,000. The crowd was paying attention now, people turning to look at this woman in expensive clothes who was bidding on a tractor without any of the careful consideration that usually accompanied purchases of this size. Tyler Hastings was watching from near the registration table, and I saw him lean over to say something to another staff member. Saw them both pull out their phones. 85,000, 88, 90. Helen's paddle went up again. 92,000. The Chadron farmer lowered his paddle and shook his head, and Robert Chambers called going once going twice sold to paddle number 4 for $92,000. And just like that, Helen Riverside had spent $14,000 more than estimate on a tractor she didn't need. Tyler Hastings was walking toward her now, Douglas following a few steps behind, and I saw the moment when recognition fully clicked into place on their faces. This wasn't just someone with money to spend. This was Helen Riverside, former owner of Riverside Agricultural Solutions, the woman who'd sold her company to John Deere for a number that had made agricultural news for weeks. Douglas reached her first, hand extended for a handshake. "Ms. Riverside, it's an honor to have you at our auction. I'm Douglas Hastings, owner of this dealership." Helen shook his hand with the efficiency of someone who'd shaken 10,000 hands in boardrooms and didn't need to make a production of it. "I know who you are. Your father bought equipment from my grandfather Frank in the 70s. Douglas smiled, pleased to have that connection acknowledged. He did. Frank Riverside was a legend in this business. If there's anything we can do to make your experience today more comfortable, any questions about the equipment?" Helen cut him off with a smile that was polite but final. "I'm here to buy. Let's keep the auction moving." Lot 14 came up at 9:45. The same 1998 John Deere 566 round baler I tried to bid on the week before, the one Tyler had suggested I couldn't afford or didn't understand or needed my son's permission to purchase. It rolled to the front on the same trailer, paint still gleaming, still exactly what I needed to replace the dying baler in my barn. Robert Chambers started the bidding at 15,000, and Helen's paddle went up immediately. 20,000. The crowd went quiet. Starting a bidding war 8,000 above the opening was aggressive even by auction standards, and people were beginning to understand that something unusual was happening here, that this wasn't normal bidding behavior. The Gordon farmer who'd won this same baler last week was here again. He raised his paddle cautiously. 21. Helen didn't pause. 24,500. The Gordon farmer looked at her, looked at the baler, looked at the auctioneer, and lowered his paddle with a shrug that said he knew when he was outmatched. Sold to paddle number 4 for $24,500. Tyler Hastings was standing near the equipment now, face pale, and I saw him say something to his father that made Douglas's expression shift from pleased to concerned. They were starting to understand that this wasn't just a wealthy customer making aggressive bids. This was something else. Helen bought Lot 18 for 41,000, Lot 19 for 33, Lot 20 for 28, each time bidding higher than necessary, each time winning without hesitation, each time adding another piece of equipment to a growing total that was climbing past 200,000 and showing no signs of slowing. At 10:45, after she'd won Lot 24, Helen turned to Robert Chambers and raised her voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "I'd like to make an announcement." The auctioneer looked at Douglas Hastings, who nodded slowly, and Robert Chambers stepped back from the microphone and gestured for Helen to take his place. She stood there in front of 250 farmers and ranchers, in front of the Hastings family who'd built this dealership over 3 generations, in front of Tyler who'd looked at my truck last week and made assumptions that were about to cost him something more valuable than money, and she spoke with the clarity and authority of someone who'd spent 5 decades learning how to make words matter. For those who don't know me, I'm Helen Riverside. I ran Riverside Agricultural Solutions until I sold it to John Deere in 2018. I'm here today because of a man in this crowd. She pointed at me, and every head turned. 250 pairs of eyes finding me standing near the back with my old truck and my work boots, and my 73 years that apparently still looked like something worth dismissing. In 1982, Clayton Morrison gave me $12,000. It was his entire savings. He was 31 years old, recently married, building his own ranch from scratch. I was 29, my grandfather was dying, and our family business was drowning in debt that every bank had refused to restructure. Clay didn't hesitate, didn't ask for collateral, didn't charge interest, didn't set a timeline, just said pay it forward someday. The morning air was still and cold, and the only sound was Helen's voice carrying across the lot like something that couldn't be ignored, even if you wanted to ignore it. I took that $12,000 and I saved my grandfather's business. Over the next 36 years, I built it into something worth $340 million. And through all of that, Clay never asked for anything back, never mentioned what he'd done, never acted like I owed him. Tyler Hastings was standing completely still now, frozen in a moment that was happening to him, whether he was ready for it or not. Last Saturday, Clay came to this dealership to bid on equipment he needed, a baler to replace one that's 42 years old and barely running. Tyler Hastings here assumed, because Clay drives a 21-year-old truck and wears work clothes and is 73 years old, that he couldn't afford a $20,000 baler. Suggested he bring his son to make decisions for him. Suggested he look at financing options or more suitable used equipment. The silence that followed had weight to it, the kind of quiet that happens when people are watching something important happen and know that talking would diminish it. What Tyler didn't know, what he didn't bother to learn before making his assumptions, is that Clayton Morrison owns 4,800 acres of Nebraska ranchland, debt-free since 2001. At current market rates, that's $52.8 million in real estate. After operating costs and equipment value, Clay is worth approximately $17 million. And he earned every single cent himself over 54 years of work that would have broken most men half his age. I could feel people looking at me, could feel the shift in how they were seeing me, from old man in work clothes to something else, something that didn't fit the easy categories Tyler had used to sort me into irrelevant. Helen wasn't finished. I've purchased 6 lots so far this morning for a total of $318,000. I'm going to continue bidding on every remaining lot in this auction, every tractor, every baler, every implement. And when I'm finished, I'm going to let Clay choose what he actually needs at my cost, which runs about 15% below retail. Douglas Hastings had gone pale, understanding now what was happening, understanding that this wasn't just about one sale or one customer, but about something larger that involved his family's reputation and his son's judgment, and the fundamental question of who deserved respect in transactions that were supposed to be built on mutual trust. The auction continued. Helen bid on Lot 23, a 2015 Case IH Magnum 240 tractor estimated at $85,000. She won it at $92,000. Bid on Lot 28, a complete sprayer system estimated at $60,000. Won it at $67,000. Bid on Lot 31, a hay operation package estimated at $140,000. Won it at $156,000. By noon, she'd purchased 23 lots totaling $687,000, and the equipment transport trucks she'd brought were being loaded with machinery that would fill all 3 flatbeds and require additional hauling. The crowd had stayed through the entire auction, watching something that would be talked about in coffee shops and feed stores and county fairs for years, watching the quiet vindication of a man who'd been dismissed, and the public education of a young salesman who'd made assumptions that were about to teach him something expensive. When the last lot sold, Helen walked over to where I was standing near my truck. The sun was high now, and the temperature had climbed into the 40s, warm enough that I'd unzipped my jacket, and she looked tired but satisfied in the way people look when they've done something difficult that needed doing. "Pick what you need, Clay." I walked through the equipment she'd purchased, past tractors that cost more than my first 10 years of ranching income combined, past implements and machinery that represented capabilities I didn't have and didn't need. I stopped at 3 items. The 1998 John Deere 566 baler I'd tried to buy last week, a 2020 John Deere 5075E compact utility tractor that would be useful for work around the ranch yard, a utility trailer that could haul either one. That's $71,000 worth of equipment. Helen nodded. The rest. I looked at the rows of machinery, at the $616,000 worth of equipment that I didn't need, but that could change someone's life if it ended up in the right hands. The 2015 case IH Magnum, give it to Emma and David Chen. They're trying to make 80 acres work with borrowed equipment that's always breaking down. That tractor would let them farm properly, let them build something sustainable. Helen pulled out her phone and made a note. The complete hay operation package. Give it to the Martinez family. Javier is 58 years old and still cutting hay by hand because machinery costs money he doesn't have. That equipment would save his back and maybe save his life. Another note. Everything else, set up an equipment loan program. Let young farmers borrow what they need, pay it back when they can, no interest. Use my name if you want, but make it about helping the next generation the way Frank helped my father. Helen looked at me for a long moment, and I saw tears in her eyes that she didn't try to hide. You haven't changed at all. The land doesn't let you change. It just teaches you the same lessons over and over until you finally learn them. Douglas Hastings approached us, Tyler following a few steps behind, looking like he wanted to disappear into the ground. Douglas extended his hand, and this time I took it because the gesture seemed genuine in a way that calculated professionalism never could be. "Mr. Morrison, I want to apologize. What happened last week was inexcusable. Tyler's behavior was inexcusable, and I'm truly sorry." Tyler stepped forward, and I could see him struggling with what to say, with how to apologize for something that couldn't be fixed with apologies, but had to be fixed anyway, because that's what decent people did when they realized they'd been wrong. "Mr. Morrison, I don't know what to say except that I was completely wrong about you. I made assumptions based on appearances, and I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover how much I regret that." I looked at him, this young man with his soft hands and his MBA from Creighton and his belief that spreadsheets told you everything you needed to know about people. Looked at him and saw someone who could become better or could become bitter, and the difference would depend on whether he learned from this moment or just endured it. You looked at my truck and my boots and my age, and you decided I wasn't worth your respect. How many other people have you dismissed the same way? His face went red, and he didn't try to deny it. Too many, I'm realizing that now. Words are easy, Tyler. What matters is what you do next. You can resign and go work somewhere else and keep making the same mistakes with different customers. Or you can stay here and fix the problem you created. Fix it so the next person who walks in wearing work clothes and driving an old truck gets treated like they matter. "I'll stay, I'll fix it, I promise." A silver Lexus pulled into the parking lot, expensive and out of place among the farm trucks, and I recognized it before the driver's door opened. Jack climbed out, Sarah, his girlfriend, emerging from the passenger side, and they walked over with the careful approach of people who weren't sure what they were walking into but knew it was important. Jack reached me, and there was something different in his face, something I hadn't seen in 20 years, maybe longer. Something that looked like respect, or maybe just recognition that his assumptions had been as wrong as Tyler's, just expressed differently. "Dad, I saw Helen's speech. Someone was live streaming the auction. It's all over social media." He pulled out his phone and showed me a video that had been posted 40 minutes ago. Already had 38,000 views, comments filling the screen with reactions that ranged from righteous satisfaction to anger at how I'd been treated to admiration for Helen's public vindication. "I told you to sell the ranch, to move to Omaha, to stop trying to do this alone because I thought you couldn't handle it anymore. I was wrong." Sarah stepped forward. This woman I'd met maybe 5 times in the 3 years she'd been dating my son, and she spoke with the directness of someone who didn't waste time on preliminaries. "Jack has spent 20 years feeling like he failed you by not wanting to be a rancher. Like choosing civil engineering instead of cattle meant he wasn't good enough. He's been wrong about that, and I've been trying to tell him, but sometimes people need to hear things from sources other than their girlfriends." Jack looked at me, and I saw in his face the same thing I'd seen in my own reflection for decades. The weight of expectations met and unmet, the burden of trying to be something you thought someone else needed you to be, the slow understanding that maybe that was never what they wanted at all. "Your mother and I never needed you to be a rancher, Jack. We needed you to be yourself, to find work that mattered to you the way this work matters to me. You build bridges that thousands of people use. That's ranching, just with concrete instead of cattle." "You really believe that?" "I've believed it for 20 years. Just didn't know how to say it in a way you'd hear." The crowd was dispersing now, people loading their purchases or heading to their trucks, the auction over and the stories already forming about what they'd witnessed. Tyler Hastings stood alone near the registration table, watching equipment being loaded, and after a moment he walked over to where I stood with Jack and Sarah and Helen. "Mr. Morrison, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "How do I fix this? Not just apologize, but actually fix what I did." I thought about that for a moment, about all the times I'd been underestimated, and all the times I'd wanted to tell people exactly what I thought of their assumptions, and about how satisfying Helen's public vindication had been, and how temporary that satisfaction would be if it didn't lead to something better. Start by seeing people instead of stereotypes. Then help someone who reminds you of yourself at your worst. That's how you pay back shame, by making sure the next person doesn't have to feel it. He nodded slowly and walked away, and I watched him go and wondered whether he'd actually change, or whether this would just become a story he told about the time he got publicly corrected by a customer worth more than his entire dealership. Helen's equipment was being loaded now. 3 flatbed trucks filling with machinery that would end up changing lives if we did this right, if we set up the loan program properly, and found the right people to help, and made sure the chain kept holding the way it was supposed to hold across generations. Jack stood beside me watching the loading, and after a while he spoke without looking at me. "I'm thinking about moving back to Nebraska, taking remote work. Sarah's been offered a faculty position at UNL studying Sandhills archaeology. We could be 90 minutes from the ranch instead of 3 hours." "You're sure?" "I'm 47 years old. I've spent 30 years proving I didn't need this place. Maybe it's time I spent some time proving I do." The sun was past its highest point now, starting the long slide toward evening, and the cold was beginning to reassert itself in the way March cold does when it remembers it's not quite ready to give up to spring. Helen climbed into her Escalade with promises to set up the equipment program within the week, to have the baler and tractor and trailer delivered to my ranch by Thursday, to make sure Emma Chen and the Martinez family got their equipment with the kind of dignity that comes from being chosen, not charity. I drove home in my old truck with Jack and Sarah following in the Lexus, and when we got to the ranch, they stayed for coffee and talked about their plans, and I listened and realized that maybe what looked like failure 20 years ago had just been someone finding a different path to the same destination. That evening after they left, I stood on the porch watching the sun set across 4,800 acres that I'd built from 320 and 29,000 in debt. And I thought about Frank Riverside, who'd started this chain in 1953, and about Walter, my father, who'd kept it going, and about Anna, who'd believed in it even when believing was harder than doubting. The phone in my pocket buzzed, a text from Tyler Hastings. "Mr. Morrison, I meant what I said about fixing this. I'm creating a training program for our staff. Called it See the Farmer, Not the Assumption. Would you be willing to review it before I implement it?" I stared at the message for a long moment, and then I typed back, "Send it over, I'll look at it." The sun dropped below the horizon, and the sky went purple, and then black, and the temperature fell below freezing. And I went inside to the warm house where Anna's presence still lived in the furniture arrangement, and the curtains she'd chosen, and the coffee mugs she'd bought at farm shows we'd attended together before ALS took her piece by piece. Tuesday morning would bring work that needed doing, cattle to check and fence to repair, and all the endless tasks that constitute the actual business of ranching underneath the drama and vindication and public moments that made good stories, but didn't feed livestock or fix equipment, or prove that land could be worth fighting for across generations. But tonight I sat in the quiet house and thought about Helen spending $687,000 to prove a point that shouldn't have needed proving, and about Tyler Hastings learning an expensive lesson about assumptions, and about Jack maybe finding his way back to something he'd been running from for 30 years. The chain holds, not because it's steel, but because people choose to hold it when their turn comes, and I'd done my part for another day, and that was enough. That had always been enough. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of cold that made your lungs ache when you breathed, temperature hovering around 10 degrees with wind that cut through layers of clothing like they weren't even there. I was breaking ice on the water tanks in the north pasture when I heard the rumble of a diesel engine coming up the gravel road, followed by the high-pitched beep of something backing up. Helen's equipment transport was making its first delivery. The driver was a man in his 50s who'd probably hauled farm equipment for 30 years and knew how to navigate mud and snow and unmarked ranch roads without getting stuck. He climbed down from the cab and walked over with the kind of nod that conveyed respect without needing words, handed me a clipboard with delivery paperwork that showed 3 items being unloaded: the 1998 John Deere 566 baler, the 2020 compact tractor, and the utility trailer. "Where do you want them?" "Barn's fine. Park them anywhere there's space." He unloaded with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, using the truck's hydraulics to lower equipment to the ground, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for machines that weighed several tons. When he finished, I signed the paperwork and he drove away, leaving me standing in my barn looking at $71,000 worth of equipment that I'd tried to buy for $20,000 last week before Tyler Hastings decided I wasn't qualified to make that decision. The baler sat there gleaming green and yellow, paint still factory fresh after 26 years, because someone had maintained it properly and stored it inside and treated it like equipment deserved to be treated. I ran my hand along the pickup teeth and checked the roller bearings and examined the twine arms, and everything was exactly as good as it had looked at the auction. Better, maybe, because now it was mine and I could use it and trust it, and not worry that this would be the season my 42-year-old baler finally gave up in the middle of a field at midnight. The phone in my pocket buzzed, a text from Emma Chin. "Mr. Morrison, there's a truck at our place trying to deliver a tractor we didn't order. Driver says it's from you. Is this real?" I called her instead of texting back, because some conversations needed voices, not typed words. "It's real. The 2015 case IH Magnum. Helen Riverside bought it at auction Saturday. I asked her to give it to you and David." Emma's voice came through tight and careful. "That's a $92,000 tractor. Helen paid for it. I just told her where it should go." "Mr. Morrison, we can't accept this. Your grandmother Margaret was one of the first people to treat me like a real farmer when I started in 1975. I was 24 years old and I didn't know what I was doing, and she gave me advice that saved my first wheat crop. This isn't charity, Emma. This is a 49-year late thank you." The line went quiet for a long moment, and I could hear her breathing, could almost see her standing in her farmyard looking at a tractor that could change everything about how they farmed their 80 acres. "How do we pay you back?" "Same way I paid your grandmother back. Farm well, raise your daughter to understand land, and when someone needs help 30 years from now, you help them." She was crying when she answered, trying to hide it but not quite managing. "We'll make you proud. You already have." I spent the rest of Thursday working on fence repair in the east section, the kind of physical labor that required attention but left your mind free to wander. And I thought about Margaret Chen and the spring of 1975, when I'd been young and desperate, and trying to figure out how to keep 320 acres from slipping away into foreclosure. She'd been 53 then, widowed 3 years earlier, and running her own grain operation after her husband died young from a heart attack at 48. And she'd seen me struggling with a wheat crop that was being attacked by army worms, and had walked over to my field uninvited and spent 2 hours teaching me about integrated pest management and crop rotation, and how to read soil moisture. She'd run that operation for another 20 years until she was 73 in 1995, then sold it to a corporate farming group, and retired to town where she lived until she died in 2003 at 81. Her daughter had moved to California and rarely visited, but her granddaughter Emma had come back in 2015 at age 23, fresh out of college with an agricultural business degree, and a determination to prove that small family farms could still work if you were smart about it, and willing to work harder than made rational sense. Margaret had never asked for anything in return for that help in 1975, never mentioned it again, just went back to her own work and let me figure out whether I was the kind of person who learned from help or the kind who resented needing it. Friday brought Tyler Hastings to my door at 3 in the afternoon, driving his personal truck, not a dealership vehicle, wearing jeans instead of the polo shirt with the company logo. He stood on my porch holding a leather binder thick enough to contain serious work, and when I opened the door he looked nervous in a way I hadn't seen at the auction. "Mr. Morrison, I wanted to show you something, the training program I mentioned." "Come in." We sat at the kitchen table where I'd sat with Helen 5 days ago, where Anna and I had made decisions for 44 years, where the coffee was always hot, and the conversations were always honest whether the honesty was comfortable or not. Tyler opened the binder, and I saw pages of printed material interspersed with photographs and highlighted text that suggested actual thought had gone into this instead of just corporate boilerplate about customer service. I called it See the Farmer, Not the Assumption. It's mandatory for everyone at Hastings dealership. Sales staff, parts counter, service department, even the receptionist. He walked me through case studies of customers who'd been misjudged based on appearance. An elderly black man who'd been redirected to used equipment and turned out to own 4,000 acres of prime Iowa farmland. A young woman in coveralls who'd been told to bring her husband and ended up buying a $250,000 sprayer system with cash. A Hispanic farmer who'd been spoken to slowly and loudly, as if he didn't understand English despite having an agricultural engineering degree from Texas A&M. Each case study included what had been done wrong, what should have been done instead, and specific training on how to recognize assumptions before they turned into actions. The binder was maybe 100 pages, detailed and thorough, and exactly the kind of thing that takes weeks of actual work to produce. This is good, Tyler. Thank you. I've been working on it every night since Saturday. Haven't slept more than 4 hours any night this week. Why? He looked up from the binder, and I saw in his face something I recognized from mirrors when I was younger. That particular exhaustion that comes from realizing you've been wrong about something important and trying to fix it before the wrongness becomes permanent. Because 6 days ago, I judged a 73-year-old man by his truck and his boots, and I almost became someone I never wanted to be. Someone like my father used to be before he learned better. What do you mean? Tyler pulled out his phone and scrolled through something, then turned it toward me. The screen showed a photograph of a document from 1987, a customer complaint form from Hastings Farm Equipment. I was going through our archives looking for examples for the training program, and I found this. A woman named Margaret Chen filed a formal complaint in 1987. Said my father Douglas had dismissed her when she tried to buy a grain drill, suggested she bring her husband even though she told him she was widowed, redirected her to a competitor because he assumed she couldn't make decisions about farm equipment. Margaret Chen was Emma's grandmother. I know, and my father never forgot it. He's carried that shame for 37 years, watching that family do business with our competitors, knowing he'd lost them through his own stupidity. That's why he gave me a choice after what I did to you: resign or fix it. He didn't want me to spend the next 4 decades regretting what I'd done. The afternoon sun was slanting through the kitchen window at that low angle it hits in late March, still weak, but getting stronger every day, promising warmth that was weeks away but inevitable. Tyler's binder sat on the table between us, representing hours of work driven by shame and the desire to be better than his worst moment. How's the program working? We've run 3 training sessions so far. 62 employees total. Sales are up 11% in the last week, but more than that, we've had 4 women come back who'd stopped doing business with us. 2 farmers who'd been buying from the dealer in Chadron for the last decade. 1 rancher who walked in Tuesday wearing clothes that looked like they'd been through a shredder and walked out with a down payment on a tractor that cost more than my annual salary. Good. Mr. Morrison, can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why didn't you just bid higher at the first auction? You could have afforded it. You could have won that baler and proven me wrong right there. I thought about that question, about the moment when I'd lowered my paddle and walked away instead of fighting, about all the times in 54 years when I'd had to choose between proving something and preserving something. Because winning that auction wouldn't have taught you anything except that I had money. Helen spending $687,000 to make a point taught you something that might actually stick. Sometimes the best response to being underestimated isn't to prove you're better than they thought. It's to show them why their thinking was broken in the first place. Tyler left an hour later with promises to send me updates on how the training was being implemented, and whether it was actually changing behavior or just making people better at hiding their assumptions. I watched his truck disappear down the gravel road and wondered whether he'd stick with it or whether the impulse to be better would fade when the shame wore off and life went back to normal. Saturday morning brought another equipment delivery, this time to the Martinez family's 40 acres 3 miles south of my ranch. I drove over at 10 to watch the hay operation package being unloaded, all the equipment that could transform how they worked their ground if they used it right. Javier Martinez stood in his yard looking at machinery that probably cost more than he'd earned in the last 10 years of manual labor, and his wife Rosa stood beside him with tears running down her face that she didn't try to hide. Their son Lucas was there too, 21 years old and home for the weekend from University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he was studying agricultural science. And when he saw me, he walked over with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he had something to say and had been practicing how to say it. "Mr. Morrison, my parents don't know how to accept this." "I know. They think it's charity. They're proud people. This is hard for them." I looked at Javier and Rosa standing by the equipment, at decades of hard work written in the way they moved and stood, and looked at machines they'd probably never imagined owning. And I understood what Lucas was trying to tell me, because I'd felt the same way in 1975, when people had offered help that felt like pity. "Is your father home tomorrow?" "Yes, sir." "Tell him I'll stop by around 3. Tell him I have a business proposition." Sunday afternoon, I drove to the Martinez place with a folder containing paperwork I'd spent 2 hours preparing, documents that would make this transaction something other than charity whether they understood it that way or not. Javier met me at the door, and we sat at his kitchen table with Lucas translating, because Javier's English was functional but formal conversations were easier in Spanish. "Mr. Martinez, I have a proposal. I need someone to manage hay production on my south and east sections. That's about 800 acres. I'm getting too old to handle it all myself, and I need someone I can trust to do it right." Lucas translated, and Javier listened with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that business propositions usually had catches that weren't immediately visible. "The equipment that was delivered yesterday, I'm loaning it to you for this work. You use it on my land and on your land. Maintenance costs we split. At the end of each season, we split the profits from my hay production 50-50. Your 40 acres you keep all the profit from, that's yours." Javier asked the question in Spanish and Lucas translated. "He wants to know what you get out of this arrangement." "Hay production managed by someone who knows how to work ground. Someone I don't have to train or supervise or worry about. And the satisfaction of knowing that equipment is being used by someone who will treat it right instead of sitting in a barn turning into scrap metal." Another exchange in Spanish, longer this time, and I could see Javier working through the proposal trying to find the angle that would make this make sense as business instead of disguised charity. Lucas turned to me. "My father says this is too generous. The split should be 70-30 in your favor since it's your land. Tell him 60-40 and we have a deal. His 60, my 40. His work is worth more than my land." The translation took longer this time and involved Rosa joining the conversation. And after 5 minutes of discussion in Spanish that I couldn't follow, Javier stood and extended his hand, and we shook on an agreement that would give his family dignity and income, and the ability to use equipment that could change their lives without it feeling like something they hadn't earned. The weeks that followed developed a rhythm that felt like progress measured in small increments that added up to something larger. Emma and David Chen's 80 acres started producing yields that their borrowed equipment never would have allowed. Lucas Martinez worked my hay ground every weekend he came home from college, learning from his father Javier, who approached the work with the kind of careful excellence that comes from spending 35 years doing things the hard way, and finally having tools that let you do them the right way. Tyler Hastings called every Monday morning with updates on the training program, and by the end of April, he reported that customer satisfaction had increased 23%, and they'd had 5 farmers return who'd stopped doing business with Hastings years ago after being dismissed or disrespected or simply not seen. Jack made good on his statement about moving back to Nebraska. He and Sarah found a house near Lincoln, and he started working remotely for his engineering firm, while she began her faculty position at UNL studying Sandhills archaeology. He came out to the ranch most Saturdays, not to work necessarily, but to be present, to walk the land he'd grown up on and remember why it had mattered before he decided it wasn't what he wanted. One Saturday in early May, he showed up while I was fixing a water line that had frozen over the winter and cracked. The kind of repair work that was easier with 2 people, but that I'd been doing alone for 5 years, because asking for help felt like admitting I couldn't manage anymore. "Hand me that wrench." He handed it to me and crouched down next to where I was working, watching the way I wrapped the pipe threads and applied the sealant, and tightened the connections with just enough force to seal without stripping. "Dad, when did you learn all this?" "Learn what?" "Plumbing, electrical, engine repair, all of it. You can fix anything on this ranch." "I learned it because I had to. Couldn't afford to call professionals every time something broke, so I figured it out. Made mistakes, fixed those mistakes, made different mistakes, fixed those too. 50 years of that, and eventually you know how most things work." "Did you want me to learn it?" The question had weight behind it, years of accumulated assumptions about what I'd expected from him and what he'd thought he'd failed to provide. "I wanted you to learn how to solve problems. Doesn't matter if it's pipe fittings or bridge calculations, the principle's the same. You see what's broken, you figure out what it needs to work right, you do the work. You learned that fine, just applied it somewhere else." We finished the repair and tested the line, and water flowed clear and cold from the tank. And Jack sat back on his heels looking at something I couldn't see, maybe just remembering things differently than he'd remembered them before. 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in mid-May, I got a call that a heifer was calving wrong. One of my ranch hands had checked on her and found her in distress. I drove to the calving barn in darkness with temperature around 40 degrees and rain starting to fall in that cold spring rain that cuts through everything. And when I got there I saw what he'd seen. Breech birth, calf coming backward, the kind of situation that kills both mother and baby if you don't intervene right. I called Jack without thinking about the time or the distance, or whether he'd be angry about being woken at 2 in the morning. "I need help." "Where are you?" "Calving barn, breech birth. I can't do this alone." "I'm coming." He arrived 40 minutes later, driving through rain that had turned steady, and he came into the barn wearing clothes that would be ruined and boots that weren't meant for this kind of work but would have to do anyway. We worked together for 90 minutes, arms deep in blood and birth fluids, pulling a calf that didn't want to come out backward, fighting against biology and time, and the increasing weakness of a heifer who was running out of strength. When the calf finally came free and took its first gasping breath, and the heifer struggled to her feet and began cleaning it with her rough tongue, Jack and I sat on the barn floor covered in fluids I didn't want to identify, exhausted and cold, and soaked through from rain that had found every gap in our clothing. "Thank you for calling me. Couldn't have done it without help." "You've been doing it without help for 5 years, since Mom died, since I stopped coming home." His voice carried something I hadn't heard before, something raw and honest that didn't have room for the careful distance he usually maintained. I left because I felt like a failure. Every time I came back here, I saw what you and Mom had built, and I felt like I wasn't good enough because I didn't want to be a rancher, like I was letting you down. The calf was trying to stand on legs that didn't quite work yet, falling and getting up and falling again, with the persistence that baby animals have because they don't know giving up is an option. Jack, I never needed you to be a rancher. I needed you to be someone who knew what work mattered and did it whether it was hard or not. You learned that. You just applied it to different work. Did Mom know that? She knew. She told me in 2019 that you were doing exactly what you should be doing, and we should be proud of you. I was proud of you. Just didn't know how to say it in a way that didn't sound like I was disappointed you weren't doing what I did. We sat there until the calf was steady on its feet and nursing, until the heifer had accepted it and seemed strong enough that we didn't need to worry about complications. And then we walked back to the house, as dawn was starting to think about breaking in the east, sky going from black to gray in that slow transition that happens when you've been up all night and watched the darkness give way. Sarah was there when we got back, must have driven over when Jack left, and she had coffee ready and dry clothes laid out, and the practical competence of someone who understood that sometimes people needed to be cold and wet and exhausted before they could have conversations they'd been avoiding for years. She poured coffee and set out eggs and toast and didn't ask questions. Just let Jack and me sit at the kitchen table in dry clothes drinking coffee that was too hot and eating food we were too tired to taste properly. Clay, can I tell you something I probably should have mentioned before? Go ahead. I'm an archaeologist. I study Native American sites in the Sandhills. Part of my research involves identifying culturally significant locations that should be preserved. I know, Jack told me. What he didn't tell you is that there's a major site on your north section, probably Pawnee, maybe 800 years old. It should have been excavated decades ago, but it's on private land and the owner never allowed access. That's my land. I know, and for 40 years you've never plowed it, never developed it, never touched it even though it has zero economic value. You protected it without even knowing what you were protecting. I knew there were artifacts there. Found pottery shards when I was a kid, arrowheads, things that seemed important even though I didn't know why. My father told me some ground is sacred whether you understand the sacred part or not, so I left it alone. Sarah looked at Jack with an expression that conveyed something I couldn't quite read. That's who your father is. That's who he taught you to be. Someone who protects things that matter even when protecting them costs you something. You do that with infrastructure. He does it with land. Same values, different application. The sun had cleared the horizon by then, and the rain had stopped, and the world looked clean in that way it looks after a spring rain, everything washed and ready to start again. Jack sat at the table where he'd sat as a child, and he looked at me like he was seeing someone he'd known his whole life, but had never quite understood until now. I'm building a house on the ranch. Sarah and I on the west section where the view is good but the ground's too rough for cattle. We want to be here, want to be part of this. You're sure? I'm 47 years old. I spent 30 years proving I didn't need this place. Maybe it's time I spent some time proving I do. The Fall County Fair came in September with weather that couldn't decide whether it was still summer or already autumn. Warm afternoons giving way to cold evenings that required jackets that hadn't been needed 12 hours earlier. I wasn't planning to go, but Emma Chen called and said she'd entered some of her cattle in the show and would I come watch. And something in her voice suggested this mattered in a way that went beyond just showing livestock. The fairgrounds were crowded with families and farmers and teenagers showing animals they'd spent months preparing, and the smell of fried food and livestock and diesel fuel from the tractor pull area mixed into something that was distinctly county fair, distinctly rural America, distinctly the kind of place where people still cared about things like cattle conformation and pie crust quality, and who could drive a tractor through an obstacle course fastest. Emma's cattle took second place in their class, good black Angus heifers that showed well. And afterward, she found me near the show ring with David and their daughter Margaret, who was 4 now, and wearing boots that were too big and a hat that kept sliding down over her eyes. "Mr. Morrison, I wanted you to meet some people." She introduced me to 7 young farmers, all of them under 35, all of them trying to make small operations work with limited capital and big dreams, and the kind of determination that either breaks you or builds you depending on whether you get help when you need it. They're all using equipment from the loan program Helen set up. Lucas Martinez is helping coordinate it, making sure the equipment goes where it's needed and comes back maintained properly. Lucas appeared from somewhere in the crowd, 21 now, and carrying himself with more confidence than he'd had 6 months ago, and he shook my hand with the firm grip of someone who understood that handshakes still meant something. "Mr. Morrison, the program has helped 47 young farmers in the last 6 months. We've loaned out everything from small tractors to complete planting systems. Default rate is 0%. Everyone pays back what they borrow or returns it in good condition. That's because you're choosing the right people. I'm choosing people who remind me of my father, people who know how to work but don't have the tools to work efficiently, people who'll treat borrowed equipment like it's more valuable than owned equipment because they understand what it means to be trusted." A man approached us, maybe 78 or 80, wearing jeans and a shirt with pearl snaps and boots that had been resoled so many times the leather had memory of every step he'd ever taken. Carl Jensen, my neighbor who'd seen the first auction and had watched everything that had followed. "Clay Morrison, I heard Tyler Hastings created that training program because of what happened to you. Word travels fast. Only kind that matters. I also heard he's licensing it to other dealerships across 3 states, 23 so far, calling it the Morrison Protocol. I didn't know that. He probably didn't want to tell you and make it seem like he was using your name for profit, but he's not charging licensing fees, just sharing the materials for free. Says it's part of fixing the problem you identified." The fair continued around us, life happening in all the small ways it happens when people gather to celebrate work and community, and the things that connect them across generations and differences. I walked through the livestock barns looking at cattle and sheep and pigs being shown by kids who might become farmers, or might become engineers or doctors or teachers, but who all understood what it meant to care for something living and be responsible for its welfare. In the commercial exhibits tent, I found Tyler Hastings standing near a booth for his family's dealership, and when he saw me, he walked over with something between eagerness and nervousness. "Mr. Morrison, I didn't expect to see you here. Emma Chen asked me to watch her cattle show. They took second place. Good for her. That Magnum tractor is making a real difference on their operation. They told me last week they're considering buying another 80 acres. That's good growth. Mr. Morrison, I wanted to tell you something. The training program has been adopted by 23 dealerships across Nebraska, South Dakota, and Kansas. They're calling it the Morrison Protocol. I should have asked your permission before using your name, but I wanted it to be about the lesson, not about credit. Are they implementing it right? Most of them. A few are treating it like a corporate checkbox exercise, but most are actually changing how they see customers. We're measuring results not just in sales, but in customer retention, in people coming back after years of doing business elsewhere, in farmers telling other farmers that they're being treated with respect. That's what matters. There's something else. We're establishing a scholarship fund. The Morrison Riverside Scholarship for young farmers, people who have the knowledge and work ethic but no capital to start operations. Initial funding is $50,000 from my family's dealership. Tyler, you don't need to do that. I know I don't need to. I want to. Because 6 months ago I was on a path to becoming someone who broke chains instead of building them. You gave me a chance to change direction. This is me taking it. Christmas Eve arrived with temperature below zero and sky so clear that stars looked close enough to touch if you climbed high enough. The house was full for the first time since Anna died, and the noise and warmth and presence of people felt strange and good, and like something I'd forgotten I needed. Emma and David Chen were there with Margaret, who was fascinated by the Christmas tree that Jack and Sarah had helped me put up for the first time in 5 years. Lucas Martinez and his parents Javier and Rosa, all of them dressed in their Sunday clothes and speaking a mixture of English and Spanish that somehow everyone understood even when the words weren't clear. Helen Riverside had flown in from Minneapolis where she'd been visiting grandchildren, and she sat in Anna's chair like she belonged there, because in all the ways that mattered she did. Tyler Hastings arrived at 7 with his father Douglas, both of them looking uncertain about whether they belonged at a gathering this personal, and I welcomed them in because the point of chains is that they connect people who might not otherwise be connected, who come from different places but end up in the same place when they follow the links far enough. Jack and Sarah had brought food, too much food, the kind of excess that happens when people want to make sure there's enough for everyone even though everyone already has enough. The kitchen table that Anna and I had made decisions at for 44 years was covered with dishes and warmth and the smell of things baking, and people moved through the house like water finding channels, natural and easy and right. We ate too much and talked too long, and somewhere around 9 o'clock, Helen stood and raised her glass of wine that she'd brought because she knew I didn't keep wine in the house. To Clay Morrison, who proved that the best response to being underestimated isn't anger, it's grace. Emma raised her glass of water. To the chain that holds across generations. Lucas stood, nervous but determined. To second chances and new beginnings. Tyler looked at his father and then at me and raised his glass. To being wrong, learning better, doing better. Jack stood last, and when he spoke his voice carried something I hadn't heard in 20 years. To coming home. We drank and the moment passed and conversation resumed, and the house felt alive in a way it hadn't felt since Anna died, since I'd been living here alone with ghosts and memories, and the slow understanding that alone wasn't the same as independent. Later, after people had left and the house was clean and quiet again, I stood on the porch in cold that made my breath visible and looked out across 4,800 acres that I'd built from 320 acres, and debt that everyone said would bury me. The land was dark and still and patient the way land always is, waiting for spring when the work would begin again, waiting for generations that hadn't been born yet, waiting with the kind of patience that only Earth can manage. My phone buzzed, a text from Tyler Hastings. Mr. Morrison, thank you for including us tonight. My father told me on the drive home that it meant more to him than I probably understood. He's carried shame about how he treated Mrs. Chen in 1987 for 37 years. Being welcomed into your home tonight, being part of that gathering, gave him something he needed. Forgiveness maybe, or just the understanding that people can change if they're willing to do the work. I typed back. Everyone deserves a second chance. Some people deserve thirds and fourths. The question isn't whether you made mistakes. It's what you do after you realize you made them. The stars overhead were sharp and bright and infinite, and somewhere out there were people whose lives had changed because Helen had spent $687,000 to prove a point, because Tyler had chosen to fix a problem instead of ignore it, because Emma and David could farm properly now, because Javier Martinez's back might last another 10 years with equipment that didn't require him to work like his grandfather had worked. The chain holds, not because it's steel, but because people choose to hold it when their turn comes, and I'd done my part for another day, and that was enough. Inside the house the warmth waited, and tomorrow would bring work, and the land would teach me the same lessons it had been teaching for 54 years, and I would listen or I wouldn't, and the consequences would be fair either way. That was enough. That had always been enough. January came in hard with temperatures that made breathing hurt and wind that found every gap in clothing and buildings, and turned cold into something that felt personal. The weather forecast on Monday morning said 20 below zero overnight with wind chill pushing it to 40 below. And by Tuesday afternoon, the prediction had proven optimistic in the way that weather predictions always are when they're trying to prepare you for something worse than you can imagine. I was in the north pasture breaking ice on water tanks at 6 in the morning, when the wind hit with force that nearly knocked me over, coming out of the northwest like something solid and angry. The sky was gray and getting darker despite the sun being somewhere behind clouds that looked like they'd been hammered flat against the atmosphere, and I knew without checking the forecast that this was the beginning of something that would test every piece of equipment and every decision I'd made about winter preparation. The blizzard arrived at noon with snow that fell sideways and wind that made visibility drop to maybe 10 feet on good stretches and 0 on bad ones. I moved cattle to the sheltered areas near the barn where wind breaks and tree lines would give them some protection, and I filled every water tank knowing that within hours they'd freeze solid and I'd be back out breaking ice with a sledgehammer that was already getting hard to swing at 74 years old. By midnight the temperature had dropped to 22 below zero, and the wind was still gusting at 40 miles per hour, and I'd been working for 18 hours straight without food, and with water only when I remembered to drink from the thermos I kept in the truck. My hands ached even through insulated gloves, and my knees complained about every step, and my back had progressed past pain into a kind of numbness that I knew from experience was worse than pain, because numbness meant damage. Wednesday brought more of the same. The temperature never got above 15 below, and the wind never stopped, and cattle that had been fine on Monday were showing signs of cold stress by Wednesday afternoon, huddling in groups, and not moving even when I brought feed because moving meant exposing yourself to wine that could kill and staying still meant maybe surviving another day. I worked through Wednesday night and into Thursday morning, catnapping for 20-minute intervals in the truck with the engine running for heat, then forcing myself awake to check on groups of cattle that couldn't check on themselves. My phone rang repeatedly, Jack calling to ask if I needed help, Emma Chen texting to offer assistance, Lucas Martinez leaving voicemails about coming over with his father. But I didn't answer because answering would have meant stopping, and stopping would have meant admitting I couldn't handle this alone. Thursday afternoon around 4 o'clock, I was in the calving barn checking on 3 heifers that were close to birthing when the world tilted sideways in a way that had nothing to do with wind or cold. My vision narrowed to a tunnel, and my legs stopped responding to what my brain was telling them, and I felt myself falling in that slow motion way you fall when your body has finally hit a limit that stubbornness can't override. I woke up on the barn floor with cold seeping through my jacket and my phone ringing somewhere nearby, Jack's name showing on the screen that I could see but couldn't reach because my arm wasn't cooperating. The ringing stopped and started again and stopped and started again, and after what might have been 5 minutes or 30, I managed to get my hand to my pocket and answer. "Dad, where are you? I've been calling for 2 hours. "Barn." "What barn? What's wrong with your voice?" "Calving barn, I'm fine." "You're not fine. Stay there, I'm coming." The line went dead, and I lay on the barn floor looking up at rafters that my father had installed in 1956, and I'd repaired in 1987, and that would probably outlast both of us. And I thought about Anna and how she'd known before I did that working this ranch alone at 74 was going to kill me eventually, and how she tried to tell me that asking for help wasn't the same as failing, but I hadn't been able to hear it while she was alive to say it. Jack found me 40 minutes later, bursting through the barn door with snow coating his jacket and fear making his face look older than his 47 years. He knelt beside me and put his hand on my shoulder, and the expression on his face when he got a good look at me told me everything I needed to know about how I must look. "Dad, how long have you been lying here?" "I don't know. What time is it?" "Almost 5. You called me at 4:10. "Then 50 minutes maybe." "Can you stand?" We found out together that I couldn't, at least not without help, and Jack got his shoulder under my arm and lifted me to my feet where I swayed like a tree in wind before my legs remembered what they were supposed to do. He walked me to his truck, and the heater was running, and the cab was warm, and the contrast between barn cold and truck warm made my skin hurt in new ways. He drove me to the house and helped me inside and sat me at the kitchen table while he called Sarah, who called Emma Chen, who apparently called everyone she knew, because within an hour my house was full of people who'd driven through blizzard conditions to check on an old man who'd been too stubborn to ask for help when he needed it. Carl Jensen showed up with his son, who was 50-something and still farming the family land. Emma and David Chen arrived with thermoses of soup and sandwiches wrapped in foil that were still warm. Lucas Martinez came with his father Javier, and even though Javier's English was limited and my Spanish was non-existent, we communicated just fine through the universal language of farmers who understood that winter could kill you if you gave it the chance. Tyler Hastings appeared at 8 o'clock with emergency cold weather equipment from the dealership, heated water troughs and livestock shelters and industrial heaters that could keep barn temperatures above freezing. He didn't ask permission, just started unloading with help from Lucas and Carl Jensen's son, setting up equipment that would make the next week survivable for cattle and the humans trying to keep them alive. Sarah arrived last, her practical archaeologist's mind already working on logistics, and she sat me down at the kitchen table with coffee I didn't want and food I didn't think I could eat, but she made me consume anyway. "Clay, when did you last sleep more than an hour?" "I don't remember." "When did you last eat a real meal?" "Monday maybe, Tuesday morning." "You've been working for 3 days straight in the worst cold in 30 years. You collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. The hospital is 40 minutes away and the roads are barely passable. You could have died out there." "But I didn't." She looked at me with the kind of patience that mothers use on stubborn children and doctors use on stubborn patients. "Luck isn't a strategy, Clay. Neither is stubbornness." Jack sat down across from me, and the look on his face was the same one I'd seen when I'd told him his mother had died. That particular combination of grief and anger and helplessness that comes from watching someone you care about make decisions that hurt them. "Dad, you can't keep doing this alone. Not at 74. Not in conditions like this. You're going to kill yourself trying to prove you can handle it." The house was full of people organizing work shifts to cover the ranch until the blizzard passed. Farmers and ranchers who dropped everything to help someone who'd spent 5 decades helping others. And I sat at the table where Anna and I had made decisions for 44 years, and I felt something inside me break that I hadn't known was holding me together. I don't know how to do this any other way. Emma Chen pulled up a chair and sat down next to Jack, David standing behind her with his hand on her shoulder, and Lucas hovered near the doorway like he wasn't sure whether he belonged in this conversation, but wasn't willing to leave it either. "Mr. Morrison, we want to propose something. David and I and Lucas have been talking about it for 2 months. We were waiting for the right time to bring it up, but I think the right time is now before you collapse in a barn again and nobody finds you." "Go ahead. We want to form a partnership. Morrison Chen Martinez Cattle Company. Your land, our labor, shared profits. You supervise and teach and make final decisions. We handle day-to-day operations. You stay on the land, but you don't have to carry the whole load alone anymore." The wood stove in the corner was putting out heat that made the kitchen almost too warm, and somewhere outside wind was rattling loose metal on the barn, and my body felt like it weighed twice what it should weigh. I looked at Emma and David and Lucas, at these three people who represented everything the chain was supposed to create, and I tried to find words for why this felt like failure, even though every logical part of my brain knew it was actually success. "I've run this ranch alone for 54 years. Sarah spoke up from where she'd been listening near the sink. "Native peoples who lived on this land for thousands of years did it communally. Individual ownership is actually the new way. Sharing is the old way, the sustainable way." Jack reached across the table and put his hand on mine. "Dad, Mom told me before she died that she was worried about you trying to do this alone. She said the ranch needed new blood, new ideas, and you were too stubborn to admit it. She made me promise to watch out for you. I'm keeping that promise now." The proposal Emma laid out was detailed and fair. Clay Morrison would retain 60% ownership and final decision-making authority. Emma and David Chen would get 25% and handle daily operations and strategic planning. Lucas Martinez would get 15% and manage livestock health and rotational grazing, with a pathway to buying out Clay's share over 20 years if that's what everyone wanted eventually. Profits would be split proportionally. Clay would stay in the ranch house for life and work as advisor and supervisor until he physically couldn't anymore. The partnership would be formalized with legal agreements that protected everyone, but were built on the same foundation of trust that Frank Riverside and Walter Morrison had used in 1953. I thought about it for 3 days while the blizzard raged and people took shifts keeping the ranch running, breaking ice and feeding cattle, and making sure nothing died that could be saved. I thought about Anna and what she would tell me if she was here. And I thought about my father Walter, who'd accepted help from Frank Riverside when he had no other choice. And I thought about 54 years of proving I could do things alone, and whether proving it one more time was worth what it would cost. On Sunday morning, when the storm finally broke, and the sun came out bright and painful on snow that had drifted 6 feet deep in places, I called Emma and David and Lucas to the kitchen table and told them yes. The partnership was formalized by mid-February, with lawyers from Lincoln drawing up agreements that made everything official and binding, and protected in the way that modern business requires even when it's based on old-fashioned trust. Jack helped with the legal review, using connections from his engineering firm to find lawyers who understood agricultural partnerships and mineral rights and succession planning. Helen Riverside called when she heard about the arrangement, and her voice carried approval mixed with something that might have been relief. Clay Morrison admitting he needs help. I never thought I'd see the day. Don't get used to it. I'm still making final decisions. That's the right structure. You know things they need to learn. They have energy you don't have anymore. Together you'll build something neither could build alone. The first month was rough. I was used to making decisions instantly based on 54 years of experience, and Emma wanted to discuss everything, and David wanted to run numbers, and Lucas wanted to try experimental grazing patterns he'd learned about in college. We fought about feeding schedules and veterinary protocols, and whether to sell cattle now or wait for better prices. And more than once I came close to telling them the partnership was a mistake, and I'd buy them out and go back to doing things the way I'd always done them. Sarah mediated when the fights got too heated, using her outsider perspective to translate between my experience-based instincts and their data-driven approaches. Jack sat in on planning meetings and pointed out when I was being stubborn for the sake of being stubborn versus when I was being stubborn because I actually knew better. The breakthrough came in March during a discussion about whether to implement rotational grazing on the south section. I wanted to stick with continuous grazing because it had worked for 50 years. Lucas wanted to try intensive rotational grazing because research showed it could increase yields by 30% and improve soil health. We argued for an hour, going in circles, until finally Emma spoke up. "Clay, what did you do when you didn't know something in 1975? I figured it out. Tried things, failed, tried different things. And if someone with more experience had offered advice, I listened if they'd earned the right to give it. Lucas has earned it. He's worked this ground for a year. He studied the science. And he's not asking you to bet the whole ranch, just let him try it on 400 acres and see what happens." I looked at Lucas, 22 now and confident in a way his father Javier had never been allowed to be, and I saw someone who understood land even if he understood it differently than I did. "All right, 400 acres, south section. You design the system, I'll approve the implementation. We'll measure results against the north section that will keep continuous. 1-year trial." Lucas's rotational grazing system worked better than I wanted to admit. By June, the south section showed grass height 3 inches taller than the north section. By August, the cattle grazing on rotational pasture had weight gains 15% higher. By October, when we ran the numbers, the 400-acre trial had outperformed the equivalent continuous grazing acreage, by enough that even I had to acknowledge that maybe college education and scientific research had something to offer beyond what experience alone could teach. We expanded rotational grazing to 1,200 acres the following year. The partnership's first full season ended in November with results that exceeded what I'd managed alone in my best years. Total revenue was $1.2 million. After expenses and operating costs, the profit was $480,000. My 60% share was $288,000, which was 4 times what I'd averaged in the 5 years since Anna died, when I'd been running the ranch alone and slowly running myself into the ground. Emma and David's 25% share was $120,000, which was life-changing money for a young family trying to build something sustainable. Lucas's 15% share was $72,000, which he was earning while finishing his agricultural science degree, and proved that education and work could support each other if the structure was right. But the numbers weren't the point. The point was that the cattle were healthier and the land was recovering, and nobody was working 18-hour days 7 days a week until they collapsed in barns. And when decisions needed making, we made them together using experience and education and data, and instinct in proportions that shifted depending on the decision. Tyler Hastings showed up one Saturday in May with news that the Morrison Riverside Scholarship had grown beyond what he'd originally proposed. Jennifer Hastings Park, Douglas's sister, who I'd helped in 1989 with a $5,000 loan to start her veterinary practice, had contributed $1 million to establish permanent funding. He sat at the kitchen table where so many conversations had happened over the years, and explained that the scholarship could now support 20 students per year indefinitely, with preference given to people like Lucas who had knowledge and work ethic but lacked capital. Mr. Morrison, Jennifer said you gave her $5,000 when she could barely afford it. She's giving back 200 times what you gave her, just like Helen gave back thousands of times what you gave her in 1982. That's how compound interest works when you invest in people. A week later, Lucas came to me with a proposal that he'd clearly rehearsed, but was nervous about presenting. His parents, Javier and Rosa, wanted to retire. 35 years of manual farm labor had destroyed Javier's back and Rosa's knees, and they wanted to move to town where work didn't mean pain and winters didn't mean survival mode. They were planning to sell their 40 acres, list it for market value, which was running around $440,000. Lucas pulled out paperwork showing what he and Emma and David had discussed. A proposal for the partnership to buy the Martinez 40 acres for $500,000. Not because the land was worth more, but because Javier's 35 years of backbreaking work was worth respect and dignity in retirement. The purchase would be structured as an annuity, $200,000 up front so Javier and Rosa could buy a house in town outright, no mortgage. $15,000 per year for 20 years as guaranteed income. Lucas would get to preserve the homestead where his family had worked and struggled and built something from nothing. What do you think, Mr. Morrison? I think your parents earned more than market value. I think we can afford to pay what they earned. And I think preserving that land under someone who loves it is worth more than whatever profit we might make from it. The partnership voted unanimously to approve the purchase. Jack's announcement that he was building a house on the ranch came in June at a Sunday dinner that had become a regular occurrence. The kitchen table crowded with Emma and David and little Margaret, who was 5 now, Lucas and sometimes his parents, Sarah with her archaeological maps and research papers, occasionally Tyler Hastings or Carl Jensen or other people who'd become part of the extended network that the ranch had spawned. Sarah and I are building on the west section. Modern sustainable design, solar and geothermal, rainwater collection, native grass landscaping. We'll be here permanently. Jack's architectural firm was designing it, a house that would demonstrate how modern building techniques could respect land instead of dominating it. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Jack, who'd left ranching, had come back to build something that combined his engineering expertise with the land, values his parents had tried to teach him. You're sure about this? Jack looked at Sarah and then at me. I'm 48 years old. I spent 30 years proving I didn't need this place. Now I want to spend whatever time I have left proving I do. Construction started in July. The foundation went in first, pilings driven deep into sandhill soil that could shift if you didn't anchor properly. Then the frame rising against sky that was blue and infinite and unchanged from when my father had built the original ranch house 70 years ago on ground 300 yards away. I watched the house go up and thought about cycles and generations, and how what looks like leaving sometimes turns out to be the long way of coming home. Lucas graduated from UNL in August with a degree in agricultural science and returned to the ranch full-time, no longer splitting time between college and work, but fully committed to the partnership and the vision of what sustainable ranching could look like when you combined traditional knowledge with modern science. His first major project was implementing a comprehensive grazing plan that divided the entire ranch into manageable paddocks with water access and shelter and rotation schedules that would maximize both cattle performance and land recovery. He presented it at a partnership meeting in September, and I sat there looking at maps and charts and data that I half understood and fully respected, because the boy knew what he was talking about even if the way he talked about it was different from how I would have explained it. How long will implementation take? 3 years for full rollout. Year 1, we do 1,200 acres. Year 2, another 1,800. Year 3, we finish the remaining 2,400. By 2027, the entire operation will be under adaptive multi-paddock grazing. Cost. Lucas pulled out spreadsheets that David had helped him prepare. Infrastructure costs are about $200,000 total over 3 years. Fencing, water systems, handling facilities. But projected increase in revenue from improved cattle performance and land health is around 15% annually once fully implemented. 3-year payback, then pure profit improvement after that. Emma added her perspective. We're not just improving profit. We're improving soil health, water retention, biodiversity. This is how we make sure the land is better when we pass it on than it was when we received it. I looked around the table at these people who were building something that would outlast all of us, and I realized that what I'd thought was giving up control was actually multiplying impact, and what I'd thought was failure was actually the successful completion of what I'd been trying to do for 54 years. All right, let's do it. September brought the fall fair again, and this time Emma's cattle took first place, Lucas's management showing in the quality of animals that came from grass-fed rotational grazing. The pride on his face when they announced the winner was the same pride I'd felt in 1979 when my first cattle won, the understanding that you could work with land and animals, and if you did it right they responded by becoming excellent. Tyler found me near the livestock barns and walked over with Douglas, his father, and there was something different in how they carried themselves, something that suggested news worth sharing. Mr. Morrison, the Morrison Protocol has been adopted by 47 dealerships across 6 states now. Customer satisfaction metrics are up an average of 31%. Employee retention has improved because people want to work places that treat customers with respect. And we're seeing measurable increases in women and minority farmers doing business with dealers who have implemented the training. That's good progress. Douglas spoke up, his voice carrying weight that hadn't been there a year ago. Clay, I carried shame for 37 years about how I treated Margaret Chen. Watching Tyler fix the same problem I created, seeing him turn it into something that's changing our entire industry, that's given me something I didn't think I'd ever get. Not forgiveness exactly, but the chance to be part of the solution instead of staying stuck in the problem. We stood there in the livestock barn that smelled like animals and hay and diesel fuel from tractors, and I thought about Frank Riverside and Walter Morrison and Anna and Margaret Chen, and all the people who'd built chains that we were still holding, still extending, still trusting to bear weight across generations. The question was never whether you made mistakes, Douglas. It was what you did after you realized you made them. October brought the first serious cold, temperatures dropping into the 20s at night, and reminding everyone that winter was coming whether we were ready or not. But this year, I wasn't facing it alone. Emma and David had moved into a house they'd built on the southeast corner of the ranch, close enough to be involved but far enough to have their own space. Lucas was living in the old foreman's cottage that we'd renovated, and Jack and Sarah's house was nearly finished, and they'd be moving in by Thanksgiving. The partnership held a planning meeting in early November to discuss winter preparation, and the difference between this year and last year was so stark it felt like comparing 2 different operations. We had 4 people to split the work instead of 1. We had heated water systems that Tyler had helped us source. We had cattle distributed across multiple pastures with shelter and wind breaks. We had backup plans and contingency protocols, and people who could spell each other when work got overwhelming. You know what this means. Emma looked up from the checklist she was compiling. What? It means I might actually sleep through a night this winter. Lucas grinned. Don't get too comfortable. January will still be January, but at least when it tries to kill us, it'll have to get through 4 of us instead of just 1. Thanksgiving arrived with Jack and Sarah's house finished, and their furniture moved in, and an invitation for dinner at their place instead of mine. The first time in 70 years that Thanksgiving dinner at Morrison Ranch hadn't happened in the original house. I drove over at noon, and the new house sat on its foundation like it had been there forever. Modern lines and traditional materials combining into something that respected land while using it differently. The house was full when I arrived. Emma and David and Margaret, Lucas and his parents Javier and Rosa, who'd moved to town but still came out for occasions like this. Helen Riverside, who'd flown in from Chicago because she never missed a chance to see what the chain she'd helped build was producing. Tyler and Douglas Hastings, looking more comfortable now, less like people who weren't sure they belonged and more like people who understood they'd earned their place through work, not just connection. Sarah had cooked turkey with help from Emma and Rosa, and the table was set with mismatched plates and glasses that came from 3 different households but somehow looked right together. We sat and ate and talked about the year that had passed and the years that were coming, and somewhere in the middle of it Jack stood and raised his glass. I want to propose a toast to my father Clay Morrison, who spent 54 years proving that stubbornness and work ethic can build empires, and then proved something harder by admitting he needed help. The glasses went up, and I felt something in my chest that might have been pride, or might have been gratitude, or might have been just the acknowledgement that what I'd thought was ending was actually transforming into something I hadn't known to hope for. Emma stood next. To the partnership, to the understanding that we're stronger together than any of us could be alone. Lucas raised his glass. To my parents, Javier and Rosa, 35 years of work that made it possible for me to be here. Tyler stood last. To second chances, and to people who give them when they're not required to. We drank and ate, and the afternoon turned to evening and people lingered, because leaving would have meant ending something that felt important in ways that went beyond food and family. Eventually, Helen pulled me aside into Jack and Sarah's living room, where floor-to-ceiling windows looked out across land that my father had started building in 1953, and I'd spent 54 years continuing. You did it, Clay. Did what? Built something that'll last. Not just land and cattle, but the structure to sustain it. Emma and David will run this ranch for 30 years. Lucas will take it beyond that. Jack's kids, when he has them, will grow up understanding land even if they choose different work. You created legacy. I just kept going until I couldn't go alone anymore. Then I let other people help. That's harder than it sounds. Most people never learn it. We stood at the window watching the sun set across 4,800 acres that would soon be 4,840 acres once the Martinez purchase finalized. Watching shadows stretch and light fade and sky go from blue to purple to black. Watching the eternal cycle that connected every day to every other day regardless of human drama. Outside the window the land waited patient and eternal. And inside the house, people talked and laughed and built the relationships that would carry forward what we'd started. And somewhere in the space between those two things was the answer to what it had all been for. The chain holds, not because it's steel, but because people choose to hold it when their turn comes. And I'd done my part and passed it forward and trusted others to carry it further than I could carry it alone. That was enough. That had always been enough. Spring arrived late that year, March refusing to give up to April and April holding on to cold, until finally in mid-May, the land woke up all at once like something that had been waiting for permission. The grass came green and fast, and the cattle moved out to pasture with the kind of energy that animals have when winter is finally behind them, and the memory of cold starts fading into just memory instead of daily reality. I stood on the porch at 6 in the morning watching the sun clear the horizon and paint everything gold. And for the first time in 5 years, I'd slept through the night without waking at 2 to check on something or worry about something or remember something that Anna would have remembered if she was still here to do the remembering. The partnership was handling morning checks, and I was learning slowly how to trust that handled meant handled, not neglected. Emma's truck pulled into the yard at 6:30, and she climbed out with coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. And I knew before she said anything that this was business, not just visiting, because business came with folders and visiting came with just coffee. Clay, the Rodriguez family 3 miles south, is selling. 240 acres, good grazing land, borders our east section. They're asking 900,000, but I think we can get it for 850 if we move fast. We sat at the kitchen table where every important decision had been made for 70 years, and she spread out maps showing how the Rodriguez land would connect to our existing operation, how it would give us access to water rights we didn't currently have, how it would round out our grazing rotation to include some higher elevation ground that stayed greener later into summer. What do you think? 6 months ago, I would have made this decision in 30 seconds based on gut instinct and 54 years of knowing land. Now, I looked at the maps and thought about capital allocation and partnership percentages, and whether buying more land made sense when we were still implementing Lucas's grazing management system across our existing acreage. What do Emma and David think? What does Lucas think? We talked about it last night after you went to bed. We're in favor if you are, but it changes the economics. More land means more investment. Fair would be adjusting partnership percentages. You'd go from 60 to 50%. We'd go from 25 to 30. Lucas would go from 15 to 20. You've thought this through. We've been thinking about it for 3 months, waiting for the right time to bring it up. I looked at the maps showing land that my father had probably looked at in 1953 when he was trying to figure out how to turn 320 acres into something sustainable, and I thought about what he would say if he could see what it had become. 4,840 acres about to become 5,080. One person working alone turned into 4 people working together. Debt and struggle turned into profit and sustainability. Let's do it. 50-30-20. More land, more opportunity, more future. The purchase went through in June. 5,080 acres of Nebraska sandhills that had been built piece by piece over 7 decades. And now it wasn't just mine anymore. And that felt right in a way I wouldn't have understood 5 years ago when alone and independent were the same word in my vocabulary. Lucas showed up at the house one evening in July with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd been practicing what he wanted to say and wasn't sure how it would be received. He was 23 now, college degree finished, working the ranch full-time, and carrying himself with confidence that came from knowing he was good at work that mattered. "Mr. Morrison, can I talk to you about something?" "Always." He pulled out paperwork that looked official and detailed, the kind of documents lawyers prepare when people are making decisions that need to last beyond handshakes and good intentions. "I want to buy you out, not force you out. Buy your 50% over 20 years with you staying on as advisor for life. You'd get $2.5 million upfront, $250,000 per year for 20 years plus free housing, plus advisor salary. Total is $7.5 million. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator humming and somewhere outside a meadowlark, singing the kind of song that sounds like optimism if birds could feel optimism. I looked at this young man who'd grown up watching his father destroy his back, working 40 acres by hand, and who'd taken the chance that equipment and education and opportunity provided and turned it into competence and vision. Why would you do this? Because I'm 23 and you're 75. If I wait until you die, I'll never learn what you still have to teach. If I buy now, we get 10, maybe 15 years of you training me. That's worth more than money. Emma and David put you up to this. We talked about it, all three of us. We think it's the right structure for the long term. You get security and income and the satisfaction of seeing what happens next. We get ownership and responsibility and the knowledge we're building something that'll outlast all of us. I'd spent 75 years building this ranch from 320 acres and 29,000 in debt to 5,080 acres, worth roughly $56 million in land value alone. I'd done it by working harder than made sense and longer than was healthy and more stubbornly than was wise. And now someone was offering me $7.5 million to let go of control while still being part of what came next. Counter proposal. You buy my 50% for $5 million total, $1 million up front, $200,000 per year for 20 years. I stay in the ranch house for life, work as advisor until I can't anymore. The $2.5 million difference between your offer and my counter, that goes into the Morrison Riverside Foundation Scholarship Fund. Why? Because I don't need $7.5 million. I need enough to live comfortably and know I'm taken care of. The rest does more good creating opportunity for people like you were 5 years ago. Lucas looked at me with something in his face that I recognized from mirrors when I was younger. That particular understanding that comes from realizing the world has people in it who measure success differently than you'd assumed success was measured. Deal, and after the buyout completes, Emma and David and I will restructure ownership. I'll hold your 50% plus my current 20, so 70 total. They'll hold 30. That gives me controlling interest to make final decisions the way you did, but they retain significant stake and full operational control. That makes sense. Keeps the leadership clear, keeps everyone invested. We shook hands across the kitchen table, and I felt something shift inside me that I couldn't quite name. Something between relief and satisfaction, and the quiet acknowledgement that what I'd thought was mine to keep forever was actually mine to pass forward when the time was right. August brought news that the Morrison Riverside Foundation had helped 89 young farmers in its first 18 months of operation. Tyler Hastings had quit his job at the family dealership to become executive director, taking the same salary but working on something that mattered more than equipment sales. The scholarship program had expanded beyond initial projections, and they were talking about adding land access programs and equipment cooperatives and mentorship networks that would connect established farmers with people just starting out. He came to the ranch one Saturday to give me an update, and we sat on the porch drinking coffee and watching cattle graze patterns that Lucas had designed using technology and science and traditional knowledge, combined into something that worked better than any of the components alone. Mr. Morrison, we've got 137 applications for next year's 20 scholarships. We're getting inquiries from Iowa and South Dakota and Kansas about replicating the model, and 3 agricultural colleges want to use our program as case studies in their farm management courses. That's good growth. It's more than that. It's proof that what you started 70 years ago is still working. Frank Riverside helped your father. Your father built something that let you help me and Helen and everyone else. Now we're helping hundreds of people and they'll help thousands. That's exponential impact. The math made sense if you thought about it like compound interest, except instead of money earning money, it was help earning more help across generations that extended beyond what any individual could see or measure. September brought Jack and Sarah's announcement at Sunday dinner that had become a weekly tradition. The kitchen table crowded with people and food and conversation that ranged from serious business to completely frivolous and back again, without anyone feeling the need to maintain strict boundaries between the two. Sarah stood and Jack stood beside her, and they both had that particular look that people have when they're about to share news they've been holding on to and can barely contain anymore. "We're pregnant, due in June." The table erupted in congratulations and questions, and Margaret Chen, who was 6 now, asked loudly whether the baby would be a boy or girl, and could she help take care of it. And through all the noise and celebration, I sat at my usual spot and felt something warm settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. Jack caught my eye across the table. "We're naming him Walter Clayton Morrison, after both grandfathers." Emma spoke up with her own news, something she'd been holding back until Jack and Sarah shared theirs. "David and I have news too. We've been approved to adopt a 3-year-old boy named James. He's been in foster care for 2 years, needs a permanent home. We bring him home next month." The celebration doubled, and I watched Emma's face light up with the kind of joy that comes from knowing you're about to change a child's life and have your own life changed in return. And I thought about chains and how they hold not just through blood but through choice and commitment and the decision to make room for people who need belonging. Later, when people had left and the house was quiet again, Jack stayed behind to help clean up, and we worked in the comfortable silence that had replaced the uncomfortable silence that used to exist between us before we'd figured out how to talk to each other honestly. "Dad, I've been thinking about what happens to this place long term, after you're gone." "I'll be gone a long time, hopefully. Got too much work left to do." "I know, but still. Lucas is buying you out over 20 years. He'll have 70%, Emma and David 30. Where does that leave family legacy?" I set down the dish I was drying and looked at my son, who'd spent 30 years running from ranching and had come back to it on his own terms in his own time. "Legacy isn't land, Jack. I used to think it was. Thought legacy was how many acres you could pass down or how much money you could leave behind, but that's not it." "What is it then?" "People, Emma and David farming better than I ever could, now expanding their family through adoption. Lucas carrying forward what his father couldn't finish. Tyler turning shame into service. You building houses that respect land instead of dominating it. Your son Walter, who will grow up understanding that work matters whether it's cattle or concrete. And James, who will learn that family is built through choice as much as blood." He nodded slowly and went back to washing dishes, and after a while he spoke without looking at me. "Mom knew this before she died. She tried to tell me, but I wasn't ready to hear it. She knew a lot of things, most of which I was too stubborn to listen to until she wasn't around to say them anymore." The partnership's second full year ended in November with results that made the first year look modest by comparison. Revenue was $1.8 million. Profit was $720,000 after all expenses, and the capital investment in the Rodriguez land purchase. My 50% share was $360,000, which was more money than I'd made in my best 3 years combined when I was running the ranch alone. But the numbers that mattered more were the ones Lucas presented at the annual meeting. Soil organic matter up 4% across all grazing land. Water retention improved enough that we'd had less supplemental watering even in a dry summer. Cattle weight gains averaged 12% higher than industry standard for grass-fed operations. Biodiversity measurements showed increases in native grass species and pollinator populations. We're not just running a ranch. We're healing land that was damaged by a century of continuous grazing. In another 10 years, this ground will be healthier than it's been since before European settlement. Emma added her perspective. And we're proving you can do it profitably. That sustainability isn't some luxury that only wealthy people can afford. It's actually more profitable than extraction once you get the systems right. I sat at the table listening to these people talk about land with the same passion I'd felt for 75 years, except they had tools and knowledge I'd never had access to. And together, we were building something that combined the best of what I knew with the best of what they'd learned. December came cold and clear with snow that fell soft and steady and made the world look clean and new. Jack and Sarah's house sat finished and occupied on the west section, smoke rising from the chimney on cold mornings, lights glowing warm in the evenings. Emma and David's house on the southeast corner was decorated for Christmas with lights that their daughter Margaret had helped string up. Lucas lived in the foreman's cottage that we'd renovated, and he kept it spare and practical like someone who understood that houses were for sleeping and working happened outside. Christmas Eve arrived with temperature right around zero, and sky so clear that stars looked close enough to touch if you could just reach high enough. The house was full by 6 o'clock, people arriving with food and presents, and the particular energy that comes from gathering with people who matter to you in places that hold meaning beyond just geography. Helen Riverside had flown in from Chicago again, making it a tradition to be here for Christmas Eve, because she said watching what the chain created was better than any gift anyone could buy her. Carl Jensen came with his son and grandson, 3 generations of farmers who'd worked neighboring land and helped each other through droughts and blizzards and market crashes that tried to break people who wouldn't break. Emma and David arrived early with Margaret and with James, the 3-year-old they'd adopted in October. He was shy still, hiding behind Emma's legs when strangers got too close, but he held tight to a toy tractor that Lucas had given him, and when Margaret took his hand to show him the Christmas tree, he followed with the tentative trust of a child learning that some places were safe. Tyler and Douglas Hastings came together, the relationship between father and son, repaired by the shared work of fixing what Douglas had broken decades ago, and what Tyler had almost perpetuated. Lucas brought his parents Javier and Rosa, who were thriving in town. Javier's back improving now that he didn't have to work ground manually. Rosa's knees getting better with physical therapy that retirement and good insurance made possible. Sarah was visibly pregnant now, 6 months along, and she moved through the house with the careful grace of someone carrying something precious and being mindful of it. Jack stayed close to her, protective in a way that was new for him, and I saw in his attention the same care his mother had shown when she was carrying him 48 years ago. The table couldn't hold everyone, so we set up additional seating in the living room, and people filled plates and found spaces, and the conversation flowed like water finding channels, natural and easy and right. Somewhere around 8 o'clock after food had been consumed, and people were settling into that comfortable fullness that comes from eating well, Helen stood and raised her glass. I want to propose a toast. 18 months ago, I spent $687,000 to prove a point at an auction. At the time, I thought it was about vindicating Clay Morrison and teaching Tyler Hastings a lesson. She paused and looked around the room at faces that represented the ripple effects of that decision. But it turned out to be about something bigger. It started a chain reaction that's still spreading. Emma and David transformed their operation and opened their home to a child who needed one. Lucas got equipment and education that let him become who he was meant to be. Tyler created a training program that's changed an entire industry. The Morrison Riverside Foundation has helped almost 100 young farmers, and Clay learned that letting go of control isn't the same as losing it. Emma stood and raised her glass, James sitting in her lap now, less shy after an hour of being around gentle people. to the partnership, to the understanding that we're stronger together than any of us could be alone, and to families built by choice as much as blood. Luca stood next. To my parents, 35 years of work that made it possible for me to be here, and to Clay Morrison, who showed me that help isn't charity when it's given with respect. Tyler stood, and his voice carried weight that hadn't been there 18 months ago. To second chances, and to people who give them when they have every right not to. Jack stood last, and he looked at me with something in his face that might have been understanding, or might have been just the acknowledgement of time and change, and the ways people learn to see each other differently. To my father, Clay Morrison, who spent 75 years building something remarkable and then did something even harder by admitting it could be better if he shared it. And to the next generation, Walter and Margaret and James, who will carry it forward in ways we can't imagine yet. We drank and the moment passed, and conversation resumed, and people moved through the house like they belonged there, because in all the ways that mattered they did. Later, when some people had left but others lingered because leaving would mean ending something they weren't ready to end, I found myself on the porch in cold that made breathing hurt, but made the stars bright enough to read by if stars were things you could read. Jack came out and stood beside me, and we looked across 5,080 acres that would soon be Lucas's to manage and Emma's to operate, and the partnerships to build into whatever came next. You did it, Dad. Did what? Built something that'll last. Not just land, but the structure to sustain it across generations. I just kept going until I couldn't go alone anymore. Then I let people help. That's harder than it sounds. Most people never learn it. Your mother tried to teach me for 44 years. Took me 5 years after she died to finally listen. We stood in silence, and the cold worked its way through jackets and jeans and boots, and after a while Jack spoke again. Sarah and I were talking. After Walter is born and we're settled into being parents, we want to be more involved in ranch operations, not running it. Emma and David and Lucas have that handled, but involved. Sarah wants to establish a land conservation program. I want to design infrastructure that serves the operation without damaging the ecosystem. I'd like that. The door opened, and Sarah appeared with blankets and handed one to Jack and one to me, and stood between us looking out at land that held stories going back thousands of years. Native peoples and homesteaders and farmers and ranchers, all learning the same lessons about what the land required and what it gave back when you treated it right. Clay, I've been documenting that Pawnee site on the north section. It's one of the most significant finds in the region. I want to work with the partnership to create a conservation easement that protects it permanently while still allowing the land to be grazed. That makes sense. Ground that's sacred should stay sacred. Inside the house, people were singing something that might have been Christmas carols, or might have been just people who'd had enough wine to think they could sing. And the sound drifted out through windows and walls, and mixed with wind and stars, and cold into something that felt like celebration, without needing to be anything more formal than that. Emma appeared at the door. Clay, Lucas wants to show everyone something. You should come see. We went inside, and Lucas had set up a laptop computer connected to the television, and he was pulling up maps and satellite images and data visualizations that turned numbers into pictures that made sense, even to people who didn't speak fluent spreadsheet. I wanted to show everyone what we've built together. This is the ranch in 2022 before the partnership formed. The image showed 5,080 acres divided into large pastures with continuous grazing patterns. Cattle concentrated in areas that showed visible overgrazing, water sources that were inadequate for optimal distribution. This is now 18 months later. The new image showed the same land divided into smaller paddocks with rotation patterns visible in different shades of green. Cattle distributed evenly, water systems improved, shelter and handling facilities added strategically. And this is the projection for 2027, when the full grazing management system is implemented. The final image showed a ranch that looked more like a natural ecosystem than a production agriculture operation, with biodiversity corridors and riparian buffers and grazing patterns that mimicked how bison had moved across these plains before European settlement disrupted everything. Tyler spoke up from where he was sitting with his father. "Lucas, what's the economic projection for that final implementation?" Revenue increase of approximately 30% over 2024 baseline. But more important than revenue, we're building soil organic matter at a rate that means in 20 years this land will be worth twice what it's worth now just from soil health improvement. We're not extracting value, we're creating it. Douglas Hastings, who'd spent 40 years selling equipment to farmers who extracted, until extraction stopped working, leaned forward with interest that looked genuine. How do other ranchers replicate this? Lucas smiled. That's what the Morrison Riverside Foundation is working on. We're documenting everything we do here and creating training programs so other operations can implement similar systems. Tyler is coordinating with agricultural extension services to spread the model. The evening wound down slowly the way good evenings do, when nobody wants them to end, but everyone knows they have to eventually. People left in groups and pairs, until finally it was just me and Jack and Sarah sitting in the living room with the fireplace putting out heat, and the house settling into the kind of quiet that comes after noise. "Jack, do you remember when you left for college?" "I remember." "I was disappointed. Not angry exactly, but disappointed that you didn't want what I wanted for you. Took me 25 years to realize that what I wanted for you and what you needed for yourself were two different things." "You never said anything." "I know, should have. Your mother told me I should tell you I was proud of you regardless of what you chose to do. I meant to, just never found the right words." "You're saying them now." "Better late than never, I suppose." Sarah stood and kissed my forehead and headed to bed, leaving Jack and me alone in the room where Anna and I had sat countless evenings talking about the day's work and the next day's plans, and all the small decisions that accumulated into a life. "Dad, when you die, what do you want done with your ashes?" The question should have been morbid but wasn't, just practical in the way farmers are practical about everything including death, because death is just another part of the cycle that turns seasons and generations. "Spread them on the north section, the sacred ground that Sarah's protecting. Put me back in soil that was here before my father bought it and will be here after everyone in this house is gone. I'll make sure it happens." He left and I sat alone in the quiet house and thought about Anna and my father Walter and Frank Riverside, and all the people who'd built the chain that I'd held for 75 years before passing it forward to people who would hold it better than I could have held it alone. Outside the window the land waited in darkness and cold, and the patience that only earth can manage, and I knew that come morning there would be work to do and decisions to make, and all the daily tasks that constitute the actual business of ranching underneath the drama and philosophy and big-picture thinking. But tonight I sat in Anna's chair and let myself feel the satisfaction of knowing that what I'd built would continue, that the mistakes I'd made had been corrected by people who saw clearly because I'd given them room to see, that the chain held not because I'd gripped it so tightly, but because I'd finally learned when to let others carry the weight. The months that followed moved with the kind of steady progress that feels inevitable once the structure is right. Lucas formally completed the buyout paperwork in March, taking ownership of 70% while Emma and David held 30%, creating the leadership clarity that large operations need while preserving the partnership's collaborative spirit. I stayed on as advisor and found that advising was easier than managing, that teaching was more satisfying than doing, that watching people make good decisions was reward enough even when they weren't the exact decisions I would have made. Jack and Sarah's son was born on a Thursday morning in early June when the grass was green and tall, and the cattle were spread across pastures that looked more like gardens than working land. They called me from the hospital at 7 in the morning, and I drove the 90 minutes to Lincoln with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the understanding that I was about to meet the person who would carry my name into a future I wouldn't see. Walter Clayton Morrison weighed 7 pounds 9 ounces and had his mother's eyes and his father's nose, and when they put him in my arms, he looked at me with that unfocused intensity that newborns have, like they're trying to figure out what this world is and whether it's worth the trouble of staying. I held him for maybe 5 minutes before exhaustion made my arms shake and Sarah gently took him back. And in those 5 minutes I told him things he couldn't understand, but that needed saying anyway. About land and legacy, and the importance of knowing when to hold on and when to let go. About chains that connect people across time and the responsibility of holding them well. About work that matters and the satisfaction that comes from doing it whether anyone notices or not. Jack stood beside me watching his son with an expression I'd seen in mirrors when he was born 48 years ago. That mixture of terror and wonder, and the slow understanding that everything had changed in ways that couldn't be unchanged. He's perfect, Dad. He is, and he's lucky to have you for a father. I hope I do better than I think I will. You'll do fine, you'll make mistakes, he'll survive them, that's how it works. That evening, I drove back to the ranch through country that was green and alive, and full of the kind of abundance that comes when land is treated right, and weather cooperates, and all the small decisions accumulate into fertility. The sun was setting as I pulled into the yard, and Lucas's truck was parked near the barn and lights were on in Emma, and David's house, and smoke was rising from Jack and Sarah's chimney on the west section, even though they wouldn't be home for a few days. I stood on the porch looking at 5,080 acres that had been built piece by piece over 70 years, and I thought about Walter Clayton Morrison sleeping in a hospital 90 minutes away, and about Margaret Chen and James learning what it meant to be part of something larger than themselves, and about Lucas and Emma and David building systems that would heal land while producing abundance, and about Tyler helping hundreds of young farmers who would help thousands more. The chain holds. Frank Riverside to Walter Morrison to Clay Morrison to Lucas Martinez and Emma Chen, and on to Walter Clayton Morrison and Margaret and James and generations not yet born. The chain holds not because any one person is indispensable, but because the structure sustains itself when built right, when passed forward with care, when held by people who understand that their turn is temporary but the chain is permanent. I went inside to the house that Anna and I had built together, and that I would occupy as long as I could before it too passed to someone else. And I made dinner and ate alone but didn't feel lonely. And when I went to bed that night, I slept the deep sleep of someone who'd finished what they'd started and could rest knowing it would continue. Spring would come again and cattle would move to fresh grass, and the land would wake from winter and teach the same lessons it had been teaching for thousands of years. Lucas would make decisions I wouldn't have made, and Emma and David would implement systems I didn't fully understand, and together they'd build something I couldn't have built alone. Jack would raise Walter to understand land even if Walter chose different work, And Margaret and James would learn from their parents that family was built through choice and commitment as much as blood and biology. And somewhere in all of that, the $687,000 Helen had spent at an auction would compound into impact that couldn't be measured in money. The Morrison Riverside Foundation would help hundreds and then thousands of young farmers who had knowledge and determination but lacked capital. And the Morrison Protocol would spread across the country, teaching equipment dealers and salespeople to see people instead of stereotypes. And the land would heal and produce and sustain because we'd finally learned to work with it instead of against it. I thought about Tyler Hastings looking at my truck and making assumptions based on paint and mileage, and the idea that old meant incapable. I thought about myself 18 months ago refusing to ask for help because asking felt like admitting failure. I thought about how much changes when you stop confusing independence with isolation and start understanding that strength sometimes looks like knowing when to let others carry weight you can't carry alone anymore. 75 years of building something from debt and doubt, and the fundamental belief that land was worth fighting for even when fighting looked impossible. 75 years of proving that assumptions were obstacles to be cleared, not truths to be accepted. 75 years of learning that legacy isn't what you keep, but what you give away and trust others to carry forward. And now, in the quiet of a June evening with my grandson sleeping 90 minutes north and my land healing under management better than I could have provided alone, I understood what Anna had tried to tell me, and what my father had known, and what Frank Riverside had demonstrated through actions more than words. The land endures, the chain holds, the work continues. And I can rest.